I was fired by the new CEO on a Friday afternoon, right when I was holding the multi-million-dollar future of the entire company in my hands, and he had no idea that I was the only person keeping our overseas partnerships alive. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below, and hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to watch an arrogant, incompetent person get a brutal reality check. My name is Stella. I am 33 years old, and for the past 8 years, I have served as the Vice President of APAC Operations for a major manufacturing firm headquartered in a sleek glass-walled skyscraper in Seattle. It was a freezing Friday afternoon, the kind where the rain lashed hard against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, matching the intense pressure inside my office. On my dual monitors, I was rapidly coordinating the final logistical hurdles for a massive $500 million manufacturing merger with our primary Asian suppliers, a complex web of international shipping schedules, compliance protocols, and high-stakes negotiations that I had personally spent the last 6 months untangling. My phone buzzed incessantly with urgent messages from Shenzhen, Tokyo, and Seoul, all demanding immediate confirmation. I had just raised my coffee mug to take a sip when the heavy mahogany door of my office swung open with a violent crash. It was Trent, my older brother, and the newly appointed chief executive officer, standing in the doorway, with a smug, self-satisfied grin plastered across his face. Trent was 35 years old, blessed with a freshly printed MBA from an expensive university and an ego the size of Mount Rainier. But he possessed precisely zero practical corporate experience outside of a brief stint managing a failing golf merchandise startup funded entirely by our father. Without a single word of greeting, he marched across the plush carpet, stopping directly in front of my desk and slammed a thick, cold manila folder down right on top of my open merger spreadsheets. The sudden impact made my coffee cup rattle against its saucer. I blinked, looking up from my screens, my mind momentarily blank as I tried to process his intrusion into my high-pressure workflow. Trent crossed his arms over his custom-tailored designer suit jacket, looking down at me with an expression of supreme condescension, as if he were a school principal about to reprimand a misbehaving student. Effective immediately, your position as Vice President of APAC Operations is being entirely restructured, Trent announced, his voice echoing with practiced corporate arrogance. And by restructured, I mean you are officially fired. The words hung in the chilling air of the office, completely disconnected from reality for a terrifying second. My breath caught in my throat, and a sharp metallic taste flooded my mouth as the sheer magnitude of his words slammed into my brain. Fired, I repeated, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper as I stared at the manila folder bearing the Human Resources logo. On a Friday afternoon in the middle of a $500 million merger, with 100 international partners waiting on my word. You heard me, Stella, Trent snapped, rolling his eyes as though my confusion were an unbearable personal inconvenience to him. We are streamlining operations, cutting the fat, and modernizing the executive suite. My new management team reviewed your division, and quite frankly, we don't need dead weight clinging to the payroll anymore. I stared at him, my analytical mind desperately trying to find any shred of logic in his insane statement. Dead. I had single-handedly brought in every major overseas supplier, negotiated our lowest cost margins in a decade, and prevented 3 separate catastrophic supply chain failures over the past 2 years alone. Every single dollar of profit this company boasted about came directly through the networks I had built from scratch, through years of relentless 60-hour work weeks, missed holidays, and endless international flights. But looking at Trent's completely blank, uncomprehending eyes, I realized he didn't care about facts, metrics, or reality. He cared about power, about exerting his new title, and about proving to our doting father that he was the undisputed king of the corporate castle. The physical sensation of betrayal hit me like a physical blow to my chest, stealing the air from my lungs and sending a sharp wave of nausea rolling through my stomach. The silence in the room stretched out heavy and suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic drumming of the rain against the glass and the muffled ringing of my desk phone as another overseas partner tried desperately to reach me. Trent reached down, tapping his manicured index finger aggressively against the manila folder containing the termination paperwork he expected me to sign without a fight. "Don't sit there looking at me like I've committed a crime, Stella," he sneered, leaning over my desk and invading my personal space. The board agreed with me. Dad agreed with me. We are bringing in a fresh dynamic vision for this company, and that vision simply does not include an overpaid glorified translator who thinks she runs the world just because she can chat in Mandarin. I felt my jaw tighten so hard my teeth ached, a sudden surge of cold fury, instantly replacing the shock and devastation that had threatened to overwhelm me just moments before. He called me a glorified translator. That single ignorant insult laid bare the absolute depth of his staggering stupidity. He genuinely believed my entire job consisted of repeating English sentences into another language, completely oblivious to the intricate web of cultural dynamics, deep-rooted business relationships, and absolute trust, known as guanxi, that governed every single transaction across the Asian markets. He had no earthly idea that the suppliers in Shenzhen didn't do business with our corporate entity. They did business exclusively with me because of me and through me. If I walked out that door, the bridge connecting this company to every single overseas partner didn't just crack, it would instantly vaporize into dust. Trent stood there waiting for me to beg, waiting for me to cry, waiting for me to panic and grovel at his feet for my livelihood, expecting the pathetic submission he was so accustomed to extracting from me throughout our entire lives. But I had spent 8 years surviving the most cutthroat corporate boardrooms in the world, and I wasn't about to break down in front of a petulant, unqualified boy playing CEO. I slowly leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, keeping my breathing perfectly steady and my facial expression completely neutral, masking the raging storm of calculations spinning inside my head. The phone on my desk continued to ring its flashing light, a silent witness to the impending catastrophe that Trent was walking blindly into. I looked down at the severance package, then back up at my brother, feeling a grim, dark sense of satisfaction wash over me as I realized the exquisite poetic justice of what was about to unfold on Monday morning. Trent shifted uncomfortably under my icy, unwavering gaze, his confident smirk faltering, just a fraction as my lack of emotional destruction failed to provide the ego boost he was clearly craving. "Well, are you going to sign the paperwork? Or do I need security to come and physically escort you out of the building?" he demanded, his voice rising in an octave of defensive irritation. I placed my hands flat on the desk, interlaced my fingers, and looked straight into his eyes, letting a very faint, ice-cold smile touch the corners of my lips. "Oh, I'll sign your little paper, Trent," I said smoothly, my voice completely devoid of any tremor or fear, "and I sincerely hope you enjoy your weekend, because come Monday morning, you're going to need all the miracles you can possibly get." Trent let out a short, barking laugh of pure derision, completely misinterpreting my warning as a bitter, impotent threat from a disgruntled ex-employee. "Save the dramatic speeches for someone who cares." "Stella," he scoffed, snatching the folder back up to have me sign the final page. "I don't need incompetent employees holding back my company, and I certainly don't need you." I picked up my silver fountain pen, the one our grandfather had given me when I graduated at the top of my class, and signed my name at the bottom of the termination agreement with absolute, unhesitating precision. I slid the document across the mahogany wood toward him, standing up slowly to tower over him for just a brief second. "Consider me gone, Trent," I said, grabbing my personal leather notebook and sliding my phone into my pocket. "I wish you the absolute best of luck on Monday. You're going to need every single ounce of it." Trent rolled his eyes, dramatically clutching the termination papers to his chest like a trophy of conquest as he turned around and marched out of my office without a backward glance, completely oblivious to the ticking time bomb he had just set off under his own feet. I stood alone in the quiet office for a long moment, listening to the rain fall outside, feeling a profound sense of liberation and vindication wash over me as I prepared to watch the magnificent empire my family built crumble into absolute ruin. Before the heavy mahogany door could fully click shut, Trent shoved it open again. His arrogant smirk had shifted into a petty, calculated sneer, clearly unsatisfied with my calm reaction. He wanted blood. He wanted to see me break. He marched right back to my desk, leaning his perfectly manicured hands on the polished wood, invading my space a second time. I forgot to mention the transition protocol. Trent barked, his voice dripping with condescension. You have exactly 1 hour to surrender all your digital assets, your WeChat login credentials, and the direct contact files for the Shenzhen executives. My new vice president of operations is moving into this office on Monday morning, and I want it completely sanitized of your presence. I looked at him, my expression a mask of absolute freezing calm. Your new vice president, I asked softly. Trent stood up straighter, puffing out his chest like a proud peacock. Yes, my new vice president. A guy I went to Harvard Business School with. He actually understands modern corporate synergy, unlike you. You have been running the Asian supply chain like some outdated mom-and-pop grocery store, flying overseas every other month just to drink tea and hold hands with factory owners. It is pathetic and horribly inefficient. My team is bringing this company into the 21st century. He paced across my office, gesturing wildly toward the massive monitors on my desk. We do not need you flying to China to play translator anymore, Stella. Do you have any idea how much money you waste on those business-class flights? My team just purchased a premium enterprise-level artificial intelligence translation software. It processes Mandarin in real time. We can negotiate $500 million manufacturing deals through a simple video call using an algorithm that costs a fraction of your ridiculous salary. You are completely obsolete. I simply stared at him, letting his profoundly ignorant boast hang in the quiet air of my office. Inside my mind, a clinical, almost terrifyingly sharp analysis was taking place. I was suppressing the crushing emotional devastation of being discarded by my own flesh and blood, channeling every ounce of that pain into pure, unadulterated logic. Trent was a fool, a dangerous, entitled fool who had absolutely no concept of how Asian business relations actually functioned. He honestly believed that dealing with a manufacturing titan like Mr. Zhang was just a matter of plugging English words into a machine and waiting for a translated response. He knew absolutely nothing about Guanxi. He did not know that Guanxi was the invisible, unbreakable currency of respect, trust, and mutual obligation that powered every single major business deal in China. Mr. Zhang did not sign contracts with a corporate logo or an artificial intelligence program. He signed contracts with me. I had spent 8 grueling years cultivating that relationship. I had spent sleepless nights helping Mr. Zhang secure emergency shipping routes when the global supply chain collapsed 5 years ago. I knew his wife's name. I knew which specific vintage of baijiu he preferred during celebratory dinners. I knew the subtle, unspoken rules of Mianzi, the concept of saving face, which dictated that you never disrespect a senior partner by pushing them off to an unproven junior executive. If Trent threw a fresh Harvard graduate and a translation app at a fiercely traditional 60-year-old billionaire like Mr. Zhang, it would not just be a failure. It would be perceived as a catastrophic, unforgivable insult. You really think an algorithm is going to close the Zhang merger on Monday? I asked, keeping my tone deceptively mild, watching him with the detached curiosity of a scientist observing a doomed experiment. I know it will, Trent sneered, adjusting his silk tie. Because business is just numbers, Stella. It is profit margins and supply logistics. You overcomplicate everything with your emotional attachments and your desperate need to feel important. The board sees it. Dad sees it. We all know you have been milking this position for years just to feel like you are on my level. But you are not. You are just an overpaid assistant who happened to learn a second language. The sheer toxicity of his words was meant to gut me, to trigger the familiar scapegoat response I had been conditioned to exhibit since childhood. Growing up, Trent was the golden child who could do no wrong. Whenever he failed, my father swooped in with a checkbook to clean up the mess. Whenever I succeeded, my achievements were immediately minimized, categorized as lucky or merely adequate. My 80-hour work weeks, my stress-induced migraines, my total sacrifice of a personal life to keep our family company afloat. All of it was reduced to nothing in the face of his unearned ego. But I refused to play the victim anymore. I reached into my desk drawer, pulled out a stack of empty USB drives and placed them neatly on the desk. The company servers hold the basic supply manifests and the official contract drafts, I said smoothly, standing up to meet his arrogant gaze. However, the direct WeChat accounts, the private mobile numbers for the Shenzhen executives, and the personal communication logs are tied to my private devices. They are my intellectual property, built on my personal time, entirely separate from the corporate network. You fired me effectively immediately, which means I have no legal obligation to surrender my personal network to you. Trent's face immediately flushed a dark, angry red. He slammed his hand flat against my desk. You work for this family, Stella. Everything you have belongs to this company. You will hand over those contacts right now, or I will have legal destroy you. Your legal department can try, I replied, grabbing my coat and my leather handbag. But considering you just proudly handed me a generic severance package that legally severs my ties to this corporation without a proper handover clause, I suggest you ask your Harvard buddies how to use their search engine to find Mr. Zhang's phone number. Trent gaped at me, his mouth opening and closing, as the first tiny fraction of reality began to crack through his bulletproof arrogance. He tried to formulate a command, a threat, anything to assert his dominance, but he was completely out of his depth. I am leaving now, I stated, walking around the desk and stepping right past him. Your new vice president can have the office. I am sure his translation app will look fantastic sitting on this desk while the Asian supply chain burns to the ground. I did not wait for his response. I walked out of the office, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor of the executive corridor. But before I left the building completely, I knew I had to make one final phone call. I pulled out my phone and dialed the only person who had the power to stop this madness, knowing full well he wouldn't. I dialed our father. The line rang 3 times before his familiar gruff voice answered the call. The faint clinking of crystal glasses and muted conversations of his private country club echoed behind him. Harrison was 62 years old. He was a man who had built his corporate empire on relentless ambition and a highly specific, archaic view of how the world should operate. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove my worth to him. I pulled countless all-nighters and sacrificed my weekends all to earn a fraction of the pride he freely gave my brother for simply existing. Dad, I said, keeping my voice incredibly steady to mask the hurricane of betrayal currently tearing through my chest. Trent just walked into my office and handed me a termination notice. He is firing me on the eve of the Zhang merger. I need you to step in and stop this immediately before he tanks a $500 million deal. I waited for the shock. I waited for the immediate booming command for Trent to get on the line. I waited for the sudden realization that his inexperienced son was about to detonate a nuclear bomb under the corporate foundation. Instead, I heard the gentle clinking of ice against crystal as Harrison took a leisurely sip of his expensive scotch. Stella, I know you are upset right now. He began employing that patronizing calm tone he always used when treating my legitimate professional concerns like childish tantrums. But we discussed this leadership transition weeks ago. Trent is the chief executive officer now. He has a very specific vision for modernization, and frankly, your persistent refusal to integrate into his new corporate structure left him with absolutely no other choice but to let you go today. My feet stopped moving entirely. I stood frozen in the middle of the polished marble lobby, completely oblivious to the junior associates rushing past me to beat the weekend traffic. He did not offer integration. Dad, I fired back, gripping my phone so tightly my knuckles turned stark white. He offered me a humiliating demotion. He brought in a guy from his college fraternity to take my title and expected me to stay on as a glorified assistant, to hand over my 8 years of painstakingly cultivated international relationships. You know, Mr. Zhang. You know the delicate Asian market better than anyone. You know they will absolutely pull out of the merger if Trent throws a basic translation application and an unproven junior executive at them on Monday morning. Harrison let out a heavy, exaggerated sigh, the kind of dramatic breath that was specifically designed to make me feel small, irrational, and overly emotional. You are being completely dramatic, Stella, he said smoothly. Trent has an Ivy League education and a brilliant team of forward-thinking strategists backing him up. The global market is constantly evolving. We do not need you flying across the globe to coddle international suppliers anymore. Trent is establishing dominance early on. Hai is showing them that our company dictates the terms. A leader needs obedience, Stella, not a daughter who always tries to outshine her brother. The words hit me with the devastating force of a physical blow, instantly knocking the remaining breath from my lungs. A daughter who always tries to outshine her brother. There it was at last. The ugly, unvarnished truth stripped of all its fancy corporate jargon and polite family excuses. It was never actually about operational efficiency. It was never about modernizing the global supply chain or integrating artificial intelligence. It was entirely about ego, pure and simple. For 8 exhausting years, I had generated record-breaking revenue, single-handedly, salvaging crucial partnerships that Harrison's own outdated negotiation tactics had nearly ruined. I had learned a notoriously difficult language, immersed myself in a completely different cultural dynamic, and essentially became the indispensable bridge keeping our company highly relevant in a fiercely competitive global market. But absolutely none of that mattered. It would never matter. Because every single time I succeeded, every single time my name was praised by the board, it cast a huge shadow over Trent. And in Harrison's archaic, deeply sexist worldview, the golden son could never be eclipsed by the daughter. My blood, sweat, and tears were never going to be enough to overcome the deep-rooted sexism and blatant favoritism that infected my family's DNA. I could double the company's profit margins, secure a billion-dollar merger, and work myself into an early grave, but I would always just be the difficult daughter who needed to learn her proper place behind the chosen male heir. Harrison genuinely did not care if the company suffered a temporary financial setback, as long as Trent was seated on the corporate throne completely unchallenged and unquestioned by anyone. I stood in the lobby, the cold marble seeping into the soles of my shoes, and felt a profound, chilling clarity wash over me. The invisible chains of obligation and familial loyalty that had bound me to this highly toxic dynamic for over 3 decades suddenly shattered. I had spent my entire life starving for validation from a man who viewed my professional competence as a direct insult to his son. "Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerously calm pitch that finally made the background noise on his end go perfectly quiet. "Do you honestly believe Trent can close the John contract without me?" "Hi is the CEO," Harrison replied stubbornly, though a tiny fraction of doubt finally crept into his arrogant tone. "He will handle it. You need to accept that your role in this company has concluded. Take your severance package, take a long vacation, and let your brother lead. Do not make this a messy family issue, Stella. Be a good sister for once. A good sister, the ultimate scapegoat title." I hung up the phone without saying another single word to him, absolutely done fighting for respect from him. I lowered the phone from my ear and slid it deep into my coat pocket. I had just ended the call without another word, and in that precise moment, a profound, icy calm replaced the burning resentment in my chest. I was entirely finished seeking validation from a father who would happily sacrifice my career on the altar of my brother's ego. However, I was absolutely not going to leave the building without my personal files and the physical evidence of my 8 years of grueling sacrifice. When the elevator doors slid open on the top executive floor, I bypassed the whispering administrative assistants and walked directly into the human resources storage room, grabbing a standard issue, heavy-duty cardboard box. I carried it back to my office, my movements precise, mechanical, and entirely devoid of the hysterical emotional breakdown my family was clearly waiting for. I had exactly 15 minutes before corporate security formally deactivated my access badge, and I was going to use every single second to erase my legacy from this ungrateful company. I started with my massive mahogany desk. I swept my personal ergonomic pens, my custom leather planners, and my private encrypted hard drives directly into the box. Next came the framed photographs decorating the bookshelves. I did not have pictures of relaxing family vacations or weekend golf trips like Trent. My frames held the literal history of my survival in this cutthroat industry. I packed the photograph of my first successful factory tour in Guangzhou, the ceremonial silk scarf, gifted to me by the Tokyo Logistics president, and the delicate hand-painted tea set Mr. Zhang had personally presented to me last Lunar New Year. Each item was a physical manifestation of my blood, sweat, and relentless dedication. To Trent, they were just foreign trinkets cluttering up his new modern aesthetic. To me, They represented $500 million of locked-in loyalty that he was about to lose forever. 8 years of missed birthdays, canceled dates, and midnight conference calls were packed away into a cheap cardboard box in a matter of minutes. As I reached for my favorite travel coffee mug, Trent sauntered back into the office, flanked by our terrified-looking head of human resources, Brenda. Trent was holding a thicker, finalized stack of legal separation documents, clearly irritated that I had not fled the building in tears yet. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms and watching me with a smug, victorious sneer, utterly failing to mask his desperate need to see me suffer. "Brenda needs you to sign the official corporate exit release," Stella Trent announced, his voice echoing loudly for the benefit of the eavesdropping staff in the corridor outside. The first paper was just the preliminary notice. "This one waives your right to sue us for wrongful termination and finalizes your severance payout. Sign it, grab your little souvenirs, and let security escort you out. I do not want you lingering and depressing the rest of the floor with your attitude." I ignored his petty taunts entirely, placing my mug securely into the cardboard box before turning my attention to the thick stack of papers Brenda nervously placed on my desk. I did not rush. I did not tremble. I stood in cold, calculated silence and read every single line of the severance document, forcing Trent to stand there and wait on my timeline. As my eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, my analytical mind immediately caught the glaring structural inconsistencies. This was not a bespoke executive termination contract crafted by our high-priced corporate lawyers. Trent, in his arrogant rush to ambush me and assert his new dominance on a Friday afternoon, had clearly downloaded a generic boilerplate separation agreement from the internet. The margins were off, the clauses were incredibly broad, and the non-solicitation terminology looked shockingly weak. I kept my face perfectly neutral, not allowing even a flicker of realization to show in my eyes. I pulled my silver fountain pen from my pocket and signed my name on the dotted line with a smooth, decisive flourish, pressing hard enough to leave a permanent indent on the wood underneath. I handed the clipboard back to Brenda, who looked at me with deep, silent sympathy. Trent immediately snatched the papers from her hands, holding them up to the light, as if he had just conquered a small nation. "Excellent," Trent gloated, stepping aside and gesturing toward the hallway with mock politeness. "Now, if you are finished hoarding your office supplies, it is time for you to leave. Do not try to contact the Shenzhen partners to say goodbye, by the way. I have already drafted a company-wide email explaining that you have decided to pursue other opportunities, and my new vice president will be handling all international communications, effective immediately." I picked up my cardboard box. It was shockingly light for something that contained the entirety of my professional life, but I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation radiating through my chest. I walked past Trent, the scent of his expensive, overwhelming cologne mixing with the smell of my own adrenaline. I navigated the long executive corridor, my heels clicking rhythmically against the floorboards, completely ignoring the wide-eyed stares of the junior executives who were peeking out from their cubicles. Trent followed closely behind me, acting as a self-appointed security guard, practically vibrating with the thrill of throwing his own sister out of the building. I reached the glass double doors that led to the main elevator bank. I pressed the call button, watching the digital numbers light up as the car ascended to our floor. The entire floor was dead silent. You could hear a pin drop as dozens of employees waited to see if I would finally crack, if I would turn around and beg for my job, or if I would scream in anger. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. The stainless steel doors slid open, revealing an empty car. I stepped inside, turned around, and placed my cardboard box on the floor at my feet. I looked directly at Trent, who was standing on the other side of the threshold, a massive, arrogant grin plastered across his face. He thought he had won. He thought he had successfully eliminated his only real competition. He genuinely believed that a fancy business degree and a translation application were going to substitute for nearly a decade of earned respect and cultural integration. I let a chilling, razor-sharp half-smile form on my lips. I looked him dead in the eyes, stripping away any remaining trace of sibling affection or professional courtesy. "I wish you good luck on Monday, Trent," I said, my voice echoing clearly into the silent hallway. Trent laughed out loud, a harsh, dismissive sound that bounced off the glass walls. "Yeah, right. Go home, Stella." The elevator doors began to close, slicing through his laughter and severing my ties to the toxic family empire once and for all. As the stainless steel sealed shut and the car began its rapid descent to the ground floor, I stood perfectly still in the quiet, humming space. Trent was entirely unaware that he had just initiated the company's absolute self-destruction, and I was going to secure a front row seat to watch the entire arrogant institution burn to the ground. 24 hours later, the adrenaline of Friday afternoon had completely faded, leaving behind the stark, quiet reality of my Saturday evening. I was sitting cross-legged on the velvet sofa in my downtown apartment, a glass of reasonably priced Cabernet resting on the coffee table. For the first time in 8 years, my phone was not vibrating with frantic logistical queries from shipping foremen in Guangdong or desperate emails from our legal team. The silence in my apartment was deafening, almost physical in its weight. Typically, I would be suffering through the mandatory weekly family dinner at my father's sprawling suburban estate in Mercer Island, forcing a polite smile while Harrison held court over catered food and suffocating expectations. Tonight, however, I was officially excised from the family narrative. I took a slow sip of my wine, savoring the absolute peace when my cell phone screen suddenly illuminated the darkened room. It was a rapid-fire series of text messages from my younger sister, Nora. Nora was 31 years old, a brilliant gallery curator who survived our family by maintaining a polite, heavily guarded distance. I unlocked my screen and opened her message thread. The very first text was a photograph taken covertly from under the edge of Harrison's custom dining table. It showed Trent standing at the head of the room wearing a ridiculous velvet smoking jacket holding a crystal tumbler of Harrison's most expensive reserve bourbon high in the air. The caption underneath Nora's photo read, quote, "To the new era of efficiency, to cutting out the corporate cancer." End quote. "You are missing a truly nauseating performance, Stella." I stared at the glowing letters on my phone, feeling a bizarre mixture of total disgust and profound vindication. Corporate cancer. That was the new label Trent had slapped on my 8 years of grueling, relentless dedication. I typed back quickly, asking Nora for the full play-by-play. Her replies came flooding in, painting a vivid, sickening picture of the golden celebration happening miles away. According to Nora, the entire evening was a masterclass in delusion. Trent was pacing around the dining room, heavily intoxicated by his own unearned power, regaling our extended family with a completely fabricated version of Friday's events. He was framing it as a bold, necessary surgical strike to save the company's profit margins. Nora texted me that Harrison was practically glowing with pride. He raised his own glass of bourbon, loudly praising Trent in front of everyone for finally demonstrating the ruthless corporate instinct required to lead an international empire. "Harrison actually just said that you were too emotional to handle the new artificial intelligence pivot," Nora wrote, her text bubbles popping up in rapid succession. "He told our uncle that you cried and begged to keep your title, but Trent stood his ground like a true leader." I let out a harsh, bitter laugh that echoed through my empty apartment. Cried and begged. They could not even grant me the dignity of my actual cold, calculated departure. They had to invent a pathetic, hysterical breakdown, because that was the only version of me that fit their deeply ingrained sexist narrative. A capable woman walking away from their abuse did not make sense in Harrison's world. Therefore, she had to be reduced to a weeping, fragile girl who simply could not handle the pressure of modern business. The texts continued, and the narrative grew even more twisted. Now that I was physically absent, unable to defend my record, the family completely unraveled my history. Nora described how Trent casually mentioned that my frequent trips to Asia were essentially paid vacations. He claimed I spent my time shopping in Tokyo and attending lavish dinners in Shenzhen, while he and his new Harvard friends were back in Seattle doing the actual heavy lifting. The extended family eagerly swallowed the lies. They nodded sympathetically, murmuring about how difficult it must have been for Trent to carry my dead weight for so long. "They are openly mocking you," Stella, Nora texted, adding an angry face emoji. "My aunt just said it was a shame you insisted on coasting on the family name instead of building your own skills." I read that specific message 3 times, letting the sheer blinding audacity of it wash over me. Coasting on the family name. I was the only person who actually spoke a second language. I was the only person who understood the intricate customs required to navigate our supply chain. I had literally built my own highly specialized skill set, precisely because the family name was completely useless in the overseas markets I conquered for them. Objective facts and documented history meant absolutely nothing when they threatened the established hierarchy. I was the designated scapegoat, and Trent was the designated golden child. When the golden child failed, the system would bend reality until it looked like a success. When the scapegoat succeeded, the system would rewrite history until the success belonged to someone else. Sitting in my quiet apartment, looking at the digital evidence of my family, gleefully assassinating my character, I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of release. Let them spin their pathetic, fabricated tales of my incompetence. Let them enjoy their fragile, manufactured victory tonight. I knew exactly what was waiting for them on Monday morning, and no amount of rewritten history was going to stop the financial avalanche Trent had just triggered. Nora sent one final message before the screen went dark. Jamal cannot take another second of this garbage. We are leaving right now. Do not move. We are coming to your place. I smiled a genuine, relaxed smile and typed back a single confirmation. I locked my phone. The dark chapter of my role as the family scapegoat officially closed forever. Less than 20 minutes after I locked my phone, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through my apartment. I had not bothered to turn on the overhead lights. The only illumination in my living room came from the amber glow of the street lamps filtering through the rain-streaked windows, casting long, distorted shadows across the hardwood floor. I was still sitting exactly where I had been, the half-empty glass of Cabernet resting loosely in my hand, my mind, a churning vortex of residual anger and cold calculation. I set the glass down on the coffee table and walked to the front door, pulling it open to reveal my sister Nora and her husband Jamal standing in the dimly lit hallway. Nora looked absolutely furious. Her expensive silk dress was slightly rumpled, and she was clutching her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were white. But my attention immediately shifted to Jamal. Jamal was 34 years old, a brilliant, ruthlessly effective African-American corporate attorney who specialized in high-stakes mergers and acquisitions for a rival firm downtown. He possessed a commanding, immovable presence that instantly altered the gravity of any room he entered. Tonight, he was still wearing his impeccably tailored charcoal suit from a Saturday afternoon client meeting, his tie loosened just a fraction, his dark eyes sweeping over me with a razor-sharp analytical intensity. He did not look like a brother-in-law arriving to offer familial comfort. He looked like a predator who had just caught the scent of blood in the water. Nora pushed past me into the apartment, kicking off her heels with a frustrated sigh. "I am so sorry we left you alone with your thoughts for so long, Stella," she said, her voice shaking with adrenaline. "But I swear to God, if we had stayed in that dining room for one more minute, Jamal was going to throw Trent through the custom bay window." Jamal stepped inside and closed the door firmly behind him, shutting out the rest of the world. He locked the deadbolt with a solid metallic click. I did not say a single word. I just watched him as he walked into the dark living room, completely ignoring the comfortable armchairs. He stood right in the center of the room, radiating a cold, focused energy. "I appreciate the restraint, Jamal," I said softly, leaning against the kitchen counter. "But you really did not have to ruin your Saturday evening for me. I am perfectly fine. I am just sitting here enjoying the profound silence of being entirely unemployed." Jamal did not offer a polite smile. He did not offer any empty, hollow sympathy or platitudes about how everything happens for a reason. He bypassed the emotional family drama entirely and immediately shifted into the cutthroat legal mindset that made him one of the most feared litigators in the city. "We did not ruin our evening," Stella Jamal said, his deep voice slicing through the quiet gloom of the apartment. "Trent ruined it the second he opened his mouth and started bragging about executing a hostile corporate restructuring without consulting a single legal advisor outside of his frat house group chat." Nora told me what he said. She told me how Harrison validated it. "It was completely disgusting, but frankly, I do not care about your father's toxic ego right now. I care about your immediate legal exposure and your strategy for survival." Nora walked over to the kitchen island and poured herself a glass of water, her hands still trembling slightly. "You should have seen him, Stella. she interjected, looking at me with a mixture of awe and residual anger. Trent was in the middle of a toast, literally bragging about how he outsmarted you, and Jamal just stood up. He did not shout. He just placed his napkin on the table, looked Trent dead in the eye, and told him that arrogance was a very poor substitute for intelligence. Then he took my hand and we walked right out the front door, while Harrison was screaming at us to sit back down. It was magnificent. I looked at Jamal, feeling a sudden immense surge of gratitude for this man who refused to play by my family's twisted rules. Thank you, I said, meaning it from the absolute bottom of my heart. Save the gratitude for when we actually win, Jamal replied, taking a few steps closer to me. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, transforming from a supportive family member into my aggressive legal counsel. Right now, you are sitting in the dark, nursing a glass of wine, when you should be preparing for a massive corporate war. I know you, Stella. I know you spent the last 8 years building an ironclad supply chain infrastructure that this company relies on to survive. If Trent actually fired you on a Friday afternoon, right before the Zhang merger, he did not just make a family mistake. He made a catastrophic legal and financial error. I took a deep breath, the sheer reality of the situation finally beginning to crystallize under Jamal's intense scrutiny. He handed me a generic separation agreement, I explained, keeping my tone as clinical and detached as his. He brought human resources into my office, but the paperwork was incredibly sloppy. It looked like a standard boilerplate template he pulled off the internet just to rush the termination process and assert his dominance before the weekend. Jamal's eyes darkened, a dangerous, calculating gleam appearing in them. A boilerplate template for an executive vice president holding the keys to a $500 million international merger. He let out a low, humorless chuckle that sounded more like a threat than a sign of amusement. Trent is an absolute idiot. He is playing corporate checkers while the rest of the world is playing chess. Jamal flipped the switch, flooding my living room with bright, unforgiving light. I need to see that termination paperwork right now, Stella, he demanded coldly. I walked over to the kitchen island, reached into my leather handbag, and pulled out the crumpled manila folder containing the termination paperwork. I slid it across the cold granite countertop toward Jamal. He took it without a single word. The polite, supportive brother-in-law was entirely gone, replaced by the shark-like litigator who routinely dismantled multi-million-dollar corporations in federal court. He pulled out the heavy mahogany stool, sat down at the island, and smoothed the wrinkled pages flat under the bright pendant lights. The silence in the apartment became absolute and suffocating. Nora moved quietly to the opposite side of the counter, wrapping both hands around her glass of water, watching her husband work. I stood perfectly still, my arms crossed over my chest, my heart beating a slow, steady rhythm against my ribs. I knew the contract was sloppy. I had seen the mismatched fonts and the overly broad indemnification clauses during my brief scan in the office. But I was not a corporate attorney. I needed Jamal to translate my brother's arrogance into a tangible legal reality. Jamal pulled a silver pen from his inside jacket pocket and began to dissect the document page by page, line by line. His dark eyes scanned the dense blocks of text with terrifying speed and precision. Every few seconds, the crisp, sharp sound of turning paper echoed through the quiet kitchen. He did not speak. His face remained a completely unreadable mask of intense concentration. I watched his pen hover over a paragraph, circle a specific phrase, and then move rapidly down the page. The tension in the room coiled tighter and tighter with every passing minute. It felt like we were standing on the edge of a massive cliff, waiting to see if the ground was going to crumble beneath our feet, or if we were about to jump and fly. Page 1 was finished. Page 2. Page 3. He paused at the fourth page, his pen hovering completely still over a thick block of text near the bottom margin. His brow furrowed deeply. He leaned closer to the paper, his eyes narrowing as he read the paragraph a second time, and then a third time. I felt a cold spike of adrenaline hit my stomach. What is it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Did he lock me out of my severance pay? Jamal did not answer immediately. He slowly lowered his pen to the granite counter. He stared blindly at the kitchen cabinets for a long, agonizing second, his mind clearly racing through 1,000 different legal permutations. And then the absolute last thing I expected happened. Jamal burst into laughter. It was not a polite, restrained chuckle. It was a massive, booming, chest-deep roar of genuine amusement that shattered the suffocating tension in the room. He leaned back in his stool, covering his face with his hands, his shoulders shaking with uncontrollable laughter. Nora jumped, splashing water over the rim of her glass, staring at her husband as if he had completely lost his mind. "Jamal, what is so funny?" Nora demanded, setting her glass down loudly. "My sister just lost her career and you are laughing like we are at a comedy club." Jamal took a deep, gasping breath, trying to compose himself, but a massive, triumphant grin remained plastered across his face. He shook his head, wiping a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye. "I am not laughing at Stella, Nora," he said, his voice thick with sheer disbelief. "I am laughing at Trent. I am laughing at the absolute staggering, monumental scale of your brother's complete incompetence." He grabbed the contract, spun it around on the counter, and pushed it toward me. He tapped his index finger aggressively against the fourth page. "Stella, when an executive at your level leaves a Fortune 500 company, the separation agreement is typically 40 pages long." Jamal explained, his eyes practically burning with predatory excitement. "It is meticulously drafted by a team of highly paid lawyers to ensure you cannot breathe a word of corporate strategy to a competitor for at least 5 years. But Trent did not go to the legal department today, did he?" I shook my head slowly, staring at the paper. "No," I replied. "He ambushed me at 4 o'clock on a Friday. If he had gone to legal, they would have told him to wait until Monday morning so they could prepare the proper transition documents and brief the board. He wanted the immediate power trip. He wanted to humiliate me right then and there." "Exactly," Jamal stated, slamming his hand flat on the counter. He wanted the instant gratification of playing the ruthless boss. So instead of consulting his own legal team, your Ivy League-educated brother went onto the internet, searched for a standard employee termination template, printed it out, and forced you to sign it. This is a generic document meant for firing mid-level retail managers, not executive vice presidents of international operations. I leaned forward, reading the text he was pointing at. It looked like standard legal jargon to me. "What does that mean for me, Jamal?" "It means he just handed you the keys to the entire kingdom," Jamal said, his voice dropping into a low, deadly serious register. "When you sign a new contract, it contains an integration clause. That clause explicitly states that this new document supersedes and entirely replaces any and all prior agreements between you and the company." Trent included an integration clause in this garbage template to make sure you could not claim any prior verbal agreements about severance pay. He paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air, his eyes locked onto mine. "But in his rush to void your old benefits, he completely forgot to include a new restrictive covenant. Stella, by forcing you to sign this specific document today, Trent accidentally voided your executive non-compete clause." The air rushed out of my lungs. The kitchen seemed to spin for a fraction of a second as the sheer, unimaginable magnitude of his words slammed into my brain. I gripped the edge of the granite counter to steady myself. "Are you telling me I am free?" I whispered, the words tasting like pure electricity on my tongue. Jamal leaned forward, resting his forearms on the counter, his predatory grin returning in full force. "Telling you that as of 4:15 this afternoon, you are entirely legally untethered from your family's corporation. You have absolutely no geographical restrictions. You have absolutely no industry restrictions. You have no non-solicitation boundaries whatsoever." Nora gasped loudly, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she finally realized exactly what Jamal was saying. "Oh my God," she breathed. "You are a free agent," Stella, Jamal continued, his voice ringing with absolute certainty. "You own your private WeChat accounts. You own your personal phone contacts. You own 8 years of established trust, loyalty in Guangxi with the most powerful manufacturing billionaires in Asia. Your brother just fired you to stroke his own fragile ego, and in doing so, he legally gave you full permission to walk directly out the door with your entire multi-million-dollar client list." I stared down at the signed paper, the exact document that was supposed to represent my ultimate defeat, my total humiliation at the hands of my toxic family. Instead, it was my emancipation proclamation. It was the deadliest weapon I had ever held. My mind began to race, calculating the time zones, the shipping schedules, and the exact location of Mr. Zhang's delegation. The devastation I had felt earlier that afternoon evaporated entirely, replaced by a cold, calculating, and ruthless drive for total victory. Trent thought he had won the war by firing the glorified translator. He had absolutely no idea that he had just armed his greatest competitor and legally opened the gates for his own destruction. Jamal stood up from the stool, buttoning his suit jacket with a sharp, decisive motion. "Well, Stella," he said, his eyes gleaming under the kitchen lights, "I suggest you pour the rest of that wine down the sink and make a pot of black coffee. We have a lot of work to do before Monday morning." I poured the expensive Cabernet down the kitchen sink, watching the dark liquid drain, and immediately started brewing a massive pot of dark roast coffee. The rest of Saturday night and the entirety of Sunday dissolved into a blur of relentless, hyper-focused execution. Jamal transformed my dining room table into a makeshift war room. He had his laptop open, drafting the articles of incorporation for my brand new consulting firm, aggressively securing the LLC registration through expedited state portals. I sat across from him, my screen filled with supply chain matrices and contact lists, extracted from my private encrypted drive. We were not building a lifeboat. We were building a warship. Jamal meticulously drafted ironclad non-disclosure agreements and fresh vendor contracts, ensuring every single legal vulnerability Trent exposed was weaponized in my favor. Nora kept the coffee flowing and ordered takeout, her initial shock completely replaced by fierce, unwavering support. By Sunday afternoon, my consulting firm was officially a registered legal entity in the state of Washington, armed with a pristine corporate structure and zero non-compete liabilities. It felt completely surreal. My family had spent my entire life trying to shrink me to fit into their shadow, and in less than 48 hours, I had laid the foundation for an empire that would eclipse theirs entirely. But having a legal entity was only half the battle. I needed to secure the absolute loyalty of the single most important piece on the chessboard. At exactly 8 o'clock on Sunday evening, which was Monday morning in Shenzhen, I picked up my cell phone and dialed the private direct line for Mr. Zhang. He was 60 years old, a seasoned manufacturing titan who commanded a massive industrial conglomerate with an iron fist and traditional values. He did not speak a single word of English, or at least that was the arrogant assumption Trent and my father operated under for nearly a decade. The line rang twice before he answered. Director Stella, his warm, gravelly voice echoed through the speaker in perfect Mandarin. "It is a pleasure to hear from you, before the official delegation arrives in Seattle." I closed my eyes, centering my breathing, knowing exactly how carefully I had to navigate this conversation. "Mr. Zhang, it is always my honor to speak with you," I replied in flawless Mandarin, maintaining the utmost respect in my tone. "I am calling to ensure your flight was comfortable and to express my deepest gratitude for the partnership we built over these past 8 years." There was a highly calibrated pause on his end. He was a master of reading between the lines, and my specific use of the past tense did not go unnoticed. "Is there an issue with the itinerary?" he asked smoothly. "No issue with your itinerary, Mr. Zhang," I answered, choosing my next words with surgical precision. "However, I felt it was my duty to personally inform you that there has been a sudden and severe shift in corporate management on our end. I will unfortunately not be present in the boardroom to welcome you this morning." A palpable silence descended over the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his brilliant strategic mind. In Asian business culture, sudden absences of key relationship managers right before a major contract signing were massive red flags, signaling instability and profound disrespect. "I see," Mr. Zhang finally replied, his voice dropping into a colder, highly formal register. "Who will be conducting the final merger negotiations? Trent has assumed full control as the new chief executive officer," I explained calmly. "He is eager to present his modern vision to you." Another long silence stretched across the connection. "I understand completely, Director Stella," he said. "I appreciate your deep loyalty in making this personal phone call. We will proceed to the headquarters as scheduled." We ended the call respectfully. I set my phone down, a fierce thrill of anticipation coursing through my veins. I had not broken any confidentiality clauses, and I had not insulted my family's company. I simply showed Mr. Zhang the respect of a direct warning, allowing his own cultural instincts to do the heavy lifting. Dawn broke over Seattle on Monday morning, painting the glass skyscrapers in brilliant shades of gold. The scene shifted entirely to the sprawling executive suite of my family's corporate headquarters. Trent strutted off the private elevator precisely at 8:30, looking like he had just stepped out of a luxury magazine spread. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit that cost more than most employees made in a month. His hair perfectly styled, his chest puffed out with completely unearned authority. He carried himself with the swagger of a conquering king who had just successfully purged a rebellion, blissfully ignorant of the legal and operational catastrophe waiting right around the corner. He snapped his fingers at the terrified administrative assistant at the front desk. "I want the premium vintage champagne iced and ready in the main boardroom by 9:45. Trent ordered, his voice echoing loudly across the quiet floor. "Make sure the catering team arranged the caviar exactly how I requested. We are celebrating a $500 million victory today, and I want everything absolutely flawless." The assistant nodded, frantically scrambling to make the phone calls. Trent smiled his smug, utterly punchable smile, adjusting his silk tie in the reflection of the glass doors. He believed that securing the largest manufacturing merger in company history was just a matter of pouring expensive alcohol and flashing a confident grin. He walked toward the boardroom, unbothered that the only person who understood the mechanics of the deal was currently sitting in a downtown apartment, armed with a fresh LLC and a newly liberated contact list. He had his translation software loaded on his tablet. He had his Ivy League friends waiting in the wings. He thought he was walking into a coronation. He had absolutely no idea he was walking directly into a massacre. Trent stood at the head of the massive mahogany boardroom table, straightening his cuffs as the catering staff hastily arranged the caviar service and silver champagne flutes. He checked his gold watch, then turned to the two men standing awkwardly by the presentation screen. One was his newly appointed vice president of operations, a smug Harvard alumni named Chad, who looked like he belonged on a luxury yacht rather than in a high-stakes manufacturing negotiation. But the real centerpiece of Trent's cost-saving revolution was standing right next to Chad. His name was Tyler, a 22-year-old fresh out of college intern who looked like he was about to pass out from sheer panic. Tyler was clutching a sleek silver tablet against his chest, like a physical shield, his knuckles completely white. Trent walked over and slapped the terrified kid on the back, nearly knocking the expensive tablet right out of his trembling hands. "Relax, Tyler." Trent boomed, his voice echoing off the floor to ceiling glass walls. "You have the premium enterprise translation application loaded, right? It cost the company a fraction of what my sister was embezzling in business class flights and lavish dinners. Just hold the tablet up, let the microphone catch the audio, and read the English output back to us. It is literally foolproof." Tyler swallowed hard, desperately tapping the screen as the application took several agonizing seconds to buffer and connect to the internet. "Yes, sir," Tyler stammered, sweat visibly beading on his forehead. But the software struggles a little with regional dialects, and it completely misses contextual honorifics. "I mean, I only took 2 semesters of introductory Mandarin online. If they use complex industry-specific jargon, the application might severely mistranslate the intent." Trent rolled his eyes, utterly dismissive of the massive flashing red flag the kid had just waved directly in his face. "It is a standard manufacturing contract, Tyler. We are talking about shipping containers and unit margins, not ancient poetry. Just push the record button when the old man starts talking. Chad and I will handle the actual high-level business strategy." At exactly 9:45, the private executive elevator chimed in the distance. The heavy glass doors of the boardroom swung open, and the temperature in the room seemed to instantly plummet by 10 degrees. Mr. Zhang stepped over the threshold, moving with the quiet, devastating authority of a man who controlled a global empire. He was flanked by 6 of his elite executive delegates, all wearing immaculate, bespoke dark suits, their expressions carved from absolute stone. They did not look like men arriving to celebrate a lucrative, friendly corporate merger. They looked like a heavily armed execution squad. Trent completely missed the deeply hostile, freezing energy radiating from the delegation. He smiled his arrogant, blinding smile and practically sprinted across the room. In Asian business culture, the initial greeting dictates the entire foundation of respect for the relationship. You approach calmly, you offer a slight bow of deference to the most senior figure, and you wait for them to initiate physical contact. Trent violated every single rule of basic etiquette in the span of 3 seconds. He aggressively closed the distance, grabbed Mr. Zhang's right hand with both of his own, and pumped it up and down, like he was greeting an old fraternity brother at a weekend football tailgate. "Zhang, my man." Trent shouted, completely oblivious to the collective silent gasp of horror from the highly traditional Chinese executives standing behind their chairman. "Welcome to Seattle. It is about time we got you over here to see how a real modern corporation operates." Mr. Zhang did not flinch. He did not smile. He slowly and deliberately extracted his hand from Trent's aggressive grip, his dark eyes locking onto the young CEO with a look of chilling, absolute zero disdain. The silence in the boardroom was sudden and deafening. The catering staff in the corner literally stopped breathing. The agonizing awkwardness stretched out heavy and suffocating as Mr. Zhang slowly scanned the enormous room, his gaze deliberately passing over the iced vintage champagne, the decadent caviar spread, and the terrified intern holding a tablet. He was looking for one specific person. He was looking for me. When Mr. Zhang's eyes finally returned to Trent, the unspoken demand was deafening, but Trent was entirely too high on his own ego to read the room. Instead of addressing the obvious absence of the executive who had meticulously orchestrated this entire $500 million deal, Trent snapped his fingers sharply at Tyler. The intern jumped, nearly dropping the tablet on the floor as he scrambled forward. Trent grabbed a crystal flute of champagne from a passing silver tray and aggressively shoved it toward Mr. Zhang. "We are cutting out the dead weight today," Trent announced loudly, gesturing vaguely toward Tyler. "My sister Stella is no longer with the company. She decided to pursue other interests, probably something less intellectually demanding. But do not worry, we severely upgraded our operational systems. Tyler here has a state-of-the-art artificial intelligence translator. We are streamlining the communication process to maximize our corporate synergy." Tyler held up the tablet with violently shaking hands. He tapped the microphone icon on the glass screen. "Welcome to our office," Tyler said in shaking English. The application spun for a second, then blared a robotic, highly unnatural, automated Mandarin translation at maximum volume directly into the quiet room. The disrespect was absolute and staggering. Trent had just committed the ultimate unforgivable violation of Mianzi, the critical cultural concept of saving face. He had taken a billionaire titan of industry, a man who commanded ultimate respect across the entire Asian continent, and forced him to listen to a glitchy robot operated by a sweating, unqualified child. Trent openly insulted the specific woman who had personally guaranteed Mr. Zhang's trust, dismissing her as dead weight, and fully expected the elite delegation to simply toast to his unearned brilliance. One of Mr. Zhang's senior vice presidents took a half-step forward, his jaw clenched tight with visible white-hot fury, ready to verbally intervene and defend his chairman's honor. But Mr. Zhang simply raised a single index finger, completely halting his delegate in his tracks. Mr. Zhang looked down at the untouched crystal glass of champagne Trent was aggressively holding out, then looked slowly back up at Trent's smug face. The suffocating tension in the room finally reached a lethal boiling point. The shiny new facade of Trent's modern corporate empire was rapidly peeling away, revealing the utter catastrophic incompetence underneath. And the actual meeting had not even officially started yet. Mr. Zhang completely ignored the extended crystal flute of champagne. He walked past Trent with the measured, deliberate pace of an apex predator, circling its completely oblivious prey. He took his seat at the exact center of the massive mahogany table, adjusting his bespoke suit jacket with a sharp, precise movement. His elite delegation immediately filed in behind him, taking their respective seats in perfect synchronized silence. They moved like a highly disciplined military unit, their faces devoid of any readable emotion. Trent lowered the rejected glass of champagne, a brief flash of annoyance crossing his arrogant face before he quickly masked it with his signature smug grin. He slammed his hands down on the opposite side of the table, leaning forward aggressively. "Let us get down to brass tacks," Trent announced loudly, snapping his fingers at Tyler to activate the tablet. We are here to finalize the $500 million logistical integration for the next fiscal year. Go ahead and translate that, Tyler. Tyler fumbled with the sleek device, his fingers slipping on the glass screen. He leaned into the microphone, his voice trembling as he repeated Trent's aggressive opening statement. The tablet buffered for 5 agonizing seconds, a spinning loading wheel reflecting in the polished wood of the boardroom table. Then the automated robotic voice blared out across the quiet room. But instead of translating logistical integration, the cheap software processed the regional American slang incorrectly. The robotic Mandarin explicitly stated that the company was preparing to financially exploit the overseas factories and forcibly absorb their manufacturing assets. A collective, involuntary, sharp intake of breath rippled through the Chinese delegation. The senior vice president, sitting directly to Mr. Zhang's right, actually gripped the edge of the mahogany table so hard his knuckles turned completely white. In a single horrifying sentence, Trent's cost-effective technological marvel had just accused a fiercely proud independent manufacturing titan of being a cheap corporate subsidiary ripe for a hostile takeover. Tyler stared at the tablet, completely oblivious to the catastrophic error he had just broadcasted. Chad, the newly appointed Harvard-educated vice president of operations, leaned back in his leather chair with his hands behind his head, entirely misreading the stunned silence as a sign of awe and total submission. Trent grinned, entirely fueled by his own delusional superiority. See that, Trent whispered loudly to Chad. You hit them hard and fast with American corporate dominance, and they immediately fall right in line. My sister used to waste hours bowing and scraping before she even opened a single spreadsheet. Trent turned his attention back to the delegation, clapping his hands together sharply. Now, regarding the unit margins on the new shipping containers, we are aggressively cutting our overhead. I expect your factories to reduce production costs by 15% starting immediately. We are not running a charity here. Tyler practically shoved his face into the tablet, repeating the demand. The artificial intelligence translation software struggled with the aggressive phrasing. It spat out a completely mangled sentence that effectively insulted the delegation's entire work ethic, demanding they stop being lazy and instantly surrender their profit margins. The atmosphere in this boardroom instantly shifted from deeply uncomfortable to lethally toxic. The air felt incredibly heavy, thick with the unspoken outrage of 6 highly respected executives who were being treated absolute garbage by an unqualified amateur. But rather than noticing the aggressive posture of the men sitting across from him, Trent doubled down. He mistook their freezing, stony silence for a successful negotiation tactic. He decided to lighten the mood with what he clearly believed was a charismatic, culturally relatable joke. Come on, gentlemen. Trent laughed, a harsh, grating sound that bounced off the glass walls. I know how you guys operate over there. We all know the real reason your profit margins are so high is because you cut a few corners on the assembly line. I mean, we are not exactly building luxury sports cars here, right? We just need the plastic widgets pumped out as fast as possible. You scratch my back with a massive discount, and I will pretend I do not see the cheap glue holding the pallets together. The translation application did not even attempt to soften the blow. It delivered the profoundly offensive, racially tinged stereotype in crisp, robotic Mandarin directly into the center of the room. He had just openly accused Mr. Zhang, a man whose entire legacy was built on uncompromising structural integrity and premium quality, of running a fraudulent corner-cutting sweatshop. It was the ultimate unforgivable insult to Mianzi. It was a direct attack on their honor, their craftsmanship, and their personal integrity. Through this entire excruciating display of unmitigated arrogance, Mr. Zhang had not moved a single muscle. He sat in his heavy leather chair like a statue carved from granite. He did not blink. He simply stared directly into Trent's eyes with a look of absolute terrifying void. The silence stretched on, incredibly dense. The sheer force of Mr. Zhang's quiet fury radiated across the table, pressing down on everyone in the room. Tyler lowered the tablet, finally registering the horrifying reality that the men across the table looked prepared for physical violence. Even Chad stopped smiling, shifting uncomfortably under the intense weight of the delegation's collective stare. The silence was not passive. It was aggressively loud. It was the heavy stillness that precedes a massive earthquake. Mr. Zhang was conducting a silent, brutal interrogation, letting Trent hang himself with his own complete ignorance. Trent's confident smile finally began to falter, cracking at the edges as he stared into the black depths of Mr. Zhang's eyes. A single bead of cold sweat rolled down Trent's temple. He opened his mouth to speak to fill the agonizing void, but his voice completely failed him. The boiling point had been reached, and the entire room waited in agonizing terror for the undisputed king of the Asian manufacturing empire to finally unleash his wrath. The silence shattered with the force of a detonating bomb. Mr. Zhang did not yell, he did not curse. He simply raised his right hand and slammed his open palm flat against the polished mahogany table. The explosive crack echoed through the massive boardroom like a gunshot. The physical impact was so violently unexpected that Trent launched backward in his heavy leather executive chair, nearly tipping it over entirely. Tyler, the terrified intern, gasped and dropped the translation tablet. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp clatter, the digital screen instantly spiderwebbing into 100 cracked shards, permanently silencing the robotic application that had just insulted a billionaire. The 6 elite executives sitting alongside their chairman did not even flinch at the deafening sound. They remained perfectly rigid, their dark eyes locked entirely on the pathetic, trembling young man sitting at the head of the table. The agonizing tension in the room rapidly coalesced into pure, unfiltered terror for Trent. The smug, unearned confidence completely drained from his perfectly manicured face, leaving behind a pale, sweating mask of genuine panic. Mr. Zhang slowly stood up. He did not rush the movement. He smoothed the lapels of his bespoke dark suit towering over the boardroom table with the terrifying absolute authority of an executioner preparing to deliver a final sentence. He looked down at the shattered tablet on the floor, then looked at the violently shaking intern, and finally locked his gaze dead center onto Trent's terrified eyes. When Mr. Zhang finally spoke, the sound completely fractured reality for my arrogant brother. He did not use the aggressive robotic Mandarin from the cheap translation application. He did not gesture for his senior delegates to interpret his anger. He opened his mouth and spoke in absolutely flawless, unaccented, Oxford-educated English. The deep baritone resonance of his voice commanded immediate and total submission from every single person breathing the air inside that room. This entire display is a catastrophic embarrassment to modern commerce. Mr. Zhang stated, his perfect English cutting through the boardroom like a beautifully sharpened blade. I have tolerated your aggressive ignorance. I have tolerated your profound lack of basic cultural respect. I have even tolerated your pathetic racially motivated assumptions regarding my manufacturing standards. But I will not tolerate sitting in this room for one more single second, listening to a severely unqualified boy attempt to run a $500 million operational negotiation. Trent sat entirely frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocated fish on a dry dock. The sheer devastating realization that Mr. Zhang had understood every single word of English spoken in that room for the past 8 years slammed into Trent like a runaway freight train. Every arrogant side comment, every condescending whisper my father and brother had ever made during previous factory tours, every time they insulted his traditional methods right in front of his face. Mr. Zhang had understood it all. He had simply chosen to wield silence as a strategic weapon, allowing my family to continually expose their own profound ignorance while I managed the actual business. Trent gripped the armrests of his chair, his knuckles turning chalk white as he desperately tried to salvage his rapidly shattering ego. I was sweating profusely now. Huge, cold drops of perspiration soaked directly through the collar of his custom-tailored Italian shirt. The expensive designer suit that had made him feel like an untouchable king an hour ago now felt like a suffocating straitjacket. He looked frantically at his newly appointed vice president of operations, but Chad was staring firmly at his expensive shoes, completely abandoning his new boss to the corporate slaughter. "Where is Director Stella?" Mr. Zhang demanded. His voice did not raise in volume, but the sheer crushing weight of the question demanded absolute compliance. "She is the only reason my manufacturing conglomerate entertained this merger. She is the only executive in this entire building who possesses the intellectual capacity and the operational integrity to handle my global supply chain." I ask you one final time, boy. Where is she? Panic completely hijacked whatever remaining rational thought Trent possessed. His entire corporate takeover was burning to the ground in less than 20 minutes. Instead of admitting the truth, instead of confessing that he had maliciously fired his sister in a pathetic attempt to steal the glory and the massive commission bonus, Trent did what every cornered narcissist does. He doubled down on a massive, easily disprovable lie. Stella is terribly ill, Trent stammered, his voice cracking violently as he scrambled to formulate an excuse. He forced a mask of deep, fake familial concern onto his sweating face, trying to project the image of a protective brother. It was completely sudden, Mr. Zhang. A severe cascading medical emergency late last night. She is currently hospitalized in intensive care, heavily medicated and completely unresponsive. We are all deeply devastated, of course. But as the new chief executive officer, I stepped in immediately to ensure our corporate partnership did not suffer any operational delays during her tragic medical absence. She would absolutely want us to push forward with the signature today. The lie was so incredibly desperate, so utterly devoid of any logical foundation, that the air in the room seemed to turn entirely toxic. Trent sat there breathing heavily, genuinely believing that his fabricated medical emergency was brilliant enough to excuse the catastrophic morning. He fully assumed Mr. Zhang would simply offer polite condolences, accept the transfer of power, and sit back down to negotiate the shipping margins. Mr. Zhang did not offer condolences. He narrowed his dark eyes, staring at Trent with a look of such absolute freezing disgust that Trent visibly withered in his chair. Mr. Zhang slowly reached into the inside pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. He did not break eye contact with Trent for a single fraction of a second. He deliberately tapped the glass screen 3 times, navigating directly to his private encrypted contacts list. He pressed the dial button and placed the phone flat on the polished mahogany table, placing it exactly where Trent had previously demanded the luxury caviar be served. The sharp electronic tone of a ringing line echoed loudly through the silent boardroom. Once, twice. The sound was deafening, bouncing off the glass walls and filling the heavy air. Trent stared at the black device, his fake mask of sympathetic concern, rapidly melting into a portrait of absolute unmitigated horror. He knew exactly what was happening, but his body was paralyzed by fear. He was entirely powerless to stop the inevitable destruction of his lie. On the third ring, the international call connected. The audio broadcasted loudly and perfectly clear through the smartphone, premium speaker echoing across the massive table for every single executive to hear. "Good morning, Mr. Zhang." My voice rang out into the boardroom, bright, energetic, and completely devoid of any medical distress whatsoever. "I trust the premium champagne was chilled to your exact preference upon your arrival." Trent let out a strangled, pathetic gasp, completely collapsing back into his leather chair as his entire fabricated empire instantly turned to ash. The crisp digital audio of my voice hovered in the freezing boardroom air, entirely destroying the fabricated illusion of my tragic hospitalization. Mr. Zhang did not blink as he stared down at Trent's pale, sweating face. He leaned slightly toward the smartphone resting on the polished mahogany table, his voice projecting a lethal, calculated calm. The champagne was perfectly chilled. Director Stella. Mr. Zhang replied in perfect English, his tone practically dripping with sophisticated irony. "However, the hospitality of your successor leaves much to be desired. It appears there has been a severe miscommunication regarding your sudden absence this morning. I was just informed by your brother that you were suffering from a catastrophic medical emergency in a local intensive care unit." A sharp, humorless laugh escaped my lips, echoing loudly through the premium speakerphone for every single person in the executive boardroom to hear. "A medical emergency?" I asked, injecting the exact right amount of professional amusement into my voice. "That is certainly an incredibly creative narrative for him to spin. I can assure you, Mr. Zhang, I am in perfect health. Unfortunately, I was unable to attend the merger finalization this morning because I was unceremoniously terminated at exactly 4 o'clock on Friday afternoon. According to the new chief executive officer sitting across from you, I was deemed utterly incompetent and completely unnecessary to the future operational synergy of this corporation." The color drained entirely from Trent's face, leaving him looking like a freshly exhumed corpse in a custom-tailored Italian suit. The suffocating silence in the room violently transformed into a collective suffocating horror. Chad, the newly minted, Harvard-educated vice president of operations, violently shoved his leather chair away from the table, physically distancing himself from Trent, as if my brother had suddenly contracted a highly contagious lethal disease. Tyler, the intern, was already pressed flat against the glass wall, staring at the shattered translation tablet on the floor, as if praying it would suddenly swallow him whole. Trent's chest heaved with rapid, panicked breaths, his desperate eyes darting wildly around the room, searching for any possible escape route from the absolute unmitigated humiliation closing in around him. But there was absolutely no escape. Mr. Jung picked up the smartphone, holding it steadily in his right hand. He did not break his terrifying predatory eye contact with Trent. "I see," Mr. Jung said, his voice dropping an octave into a register of pure, uncompromising authority. "Terminated for incompetence. That is a fascinating business strategy, considering you single-handedly engineered this entire $500 million logistical framework from the ground up over the past 8 months. I did exactly what was required to ensure a mutually beneficial partnership between our two great organizations." "Mr. Zhang," I replied smoothly, ensuring my tone remained perfectly respectful to him, while simultaneously sharpening the blade aimed directly at my brother's throat. "It deeply saddens me that the current corporate leadership does not value the established trust and the meticulous operational standards we built together. But I respect their executive decision to move forward with a more cost-effective automated approach to international relations." Trent gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles practically bursting through his pale skin. "Stella," he hissed loudly, his voice cracking with sheer, unfiltered panic, "shut your mouth right now. You are violating corporate confidentiality. I will have the legal department destroy you. I will sue you for every single penny you have." Mr. Zhang slammed his left hand onto the table, the sharp, violent crack instantly silencing Trent's pathetic, desperate outburst. "You will not speak to her," Mr. Zhang commanded, his flawless Oxford English echoing with the terrifying force of a seasoned military general. "You have absolutely no right to threaten the only person in your entire bloodline who possesses an ounce of genuine operational integrity." Mr. Zhang slowly stood up to his full height, towering over the shattered remains of Trent's arrogant facade. The 6 elite executives sitting behind him mirrored the movement perfectly, standing up in unison, a silent, imposing wall of bespoke dark suits and absolute corporate dominance. The sheer physical intimidation radiating from the delegation forced Trent to shrink back into his chair, his aggressive bravado entirely evaporated. "Let me make this perfectly clear to you, boy," Mr. Zhang stated, his dark eyes burning with unbridled disgust. "I do not do business with a corporate logo. I do not do business with an unearned executive title printed on heavy cardstock. I do business with people I absolutely trust. My manufacturing conglomerate agreed to this massive financial integration based entirely on the personal integrity, the relentless work ethic, and the brilliant strategic mind of Director Stella. We committed $500 million to this venture because she spent 8 years proving to my organization that she understands the fundamental concept of mutual respect and honor." Mr. Zhang leaned forward, planting both hands firmly on the polished wood, bringing his face dangerously close to Trent's sweating, terrified face. "You arrogantly assumed that you could simply steal her meticulous labor, fire her, to stroke your own fragile, pathetic ego, and then sit in this room and reap the financial rewards of a king. You thought you could replace a decade of established loyalty with a cheap software application and a deeply offensive, culturally illiterate joke about my manufacturing standards. You are not a chief executive officer. You are a severely overgrown child playing dress-up in your father's company, and you have absolutely no idea how the real world operates." Trent's jaw trembled uncontrollably. He tried to speak, tried to formulate a single coherent sentence to defend his shattered ego, but his voice completely abandoned him. The magnitude of his catastrophic failure was absolute and undeniable. He had not just lost a lucrative contract, he had fundamentally destroyed his family's corporate reputation in front of the single most powerful industrial magnate in Asia. "I will not sign a single document with your organization," Mr. Zhang declared, his voice ringing with absolute finality. I am officially withdrawing my conglomerate from this merger effective immediately. Furthermore, I will ensure that every single manufacturing partner, every logistics director, and every supply chain executive in my vast network is fully briefed on the catastrophic incompetence of your leadership. You will never secure another international contract on the Asian continent for as long as I draw breath. Mr. Zhang lifted the smartphone to his mouth. Director Stella, he said, his tone instantly softening from lethal fury to profound professional respect. It is a terrible tragedy that your family's corporation is entirely blind to your immense value. I look forward to discussing future independent ventures with you very soon. I smiled, sitting at my dining room table, staring at my newly registered LLC documents. The pleasure is entirely mine, Mr. Zhang, I replied. Have a safe flight back to Shenzhen. Mr. Zhang ended the call. He dropped the smartphone into his suit pocket, turned his back on Trent without another single word, and marched directly out of the boardroom. The entire delegation followed in perfect silent synchronization, leaving Trent sitting entirely alone in the suffocating wreckage of his own arrogant, spectacular destruction. Mr. Zhang reached the heavy glass doors of the boardroom, his hand hovering over the handle. The entire room held its collective breath. Suddenly he stopped and slowly turned around. The 6 elite executives instantly parted, creating a clear, intimidating path back to the mahogany table. Trent snapped his head up. A pathetic glimmer of hope flashed across his pale face. He genuinely believed the billionaire was coming back to negotiate. I thought the dramatic exit was simply a harsh bargaining tactic. Trent forced a weak, trembling smile and pushed his chair back, desperately ready to offer massive financial concessions to save his fragile ego. Mr. Zhang did not say a single word. He walked with measured, predatory grace directly back to the enormous table. He ignored Trent entirely. Instead, he reached out and grabbed the thick premium leather folio sitting perfectly centered on the polished wood. Inside that binding was the 50-page $500 million final merger agreement, printed on heavy bonded paper. Mr. Zhang opened the cover, bypassing the financial clauses, turning directly to the final signature page. The silence in the room was so absolute and heavy that the crisp sound of turning paper echoed loudly across the glass walls. He pulled the signature page completely out of the heavy binding. He held it up directly in front of Trent's face, forcing my brother to look closely at the printed line where his unearned title sat waiting for ink. Mr. Zhang grabbed the thick parchment with both hands. With a single sharp and violently decisive motion, he tore the contract cleanly in half. The ripping sound was physically agonizing. It was the distinct sound of a family empire instantly evaporating into thin air. Trent let out a choked gasp, throwing his hands up as if trying to physically catch the millions of dollars slipping through his fingers. Mr. Zhang did not break his terrifying eye contact. He released the halves, letting the ruined paper flutter slowly through the heavy air and land directly on Trent's expensive Italian leather shoes. Mr. Zhang turned his back for the absolute final time. He marched out of the boardroom, his posture radiating pure, uncompromising dominance. The elite delegation followed immediately behind him, their synchronized footsteps echoing down the marble hallway, growing fainter and fainter, until the heavy glass doors finally swung shut, sealing Trent inside his own self-made tomb. The exodus was complete, and the immediate aftermath inside the corporate suite was absolute chaos. Chad did not wait for an order from his boss. He pulled out his smartphone, frantically texting his Ivy League network, desperately trying to distance himself from the toxic blast radius. Tyler scrambled on his hands and knees, scooping up the shattered tablet before sprinting directly for the emergency stairwell. The catering staff abandoned the caviar and champagne, quietly slipping out the service doors to immediately gossip with the administrative assistants below. Trent remained frozen in his luxurious leather chair, staring blankly at the torn paper resting on his shoes. He was completely paralyzed. He had spent his entire life being protected by my father, shielded from every single consequence of his own aggressive incompetence. But there was absolutely no shield big enough to deflect a $500 million catastrophe. The narrative of the botched meeting did not stay contained within the corporate walls. In the modern corporate world, blood in the water attracts sharks with terrifying speed. The freefall began before the Chinese delegation even reached their armored vehicles. The terrified front desk assistant texted a close friend at a competing logistics firm. Chad sent a frantic email to a headhunter mentioning a catastrophic leadership failure. Within exactly 2 hours, the rumor of the brutal cultural insult and the ruined merger leaked out of the building and flooded the global industry network. I sat alone in my apartment sipping my black coffee, watching the dual monitors set up on my dining room table. I did not have to make a single phone call. I simply watched the inevitable destruction unfold in real time. At exactly noon, a prominent financial blog published a blind item about an unmitigated disaster occurring at a Seattle-based manufacturing corporation. By 1 o'clock, major financial news anchors were breaking into their scheduled programming. They accurately reported the disastrous translation application, the severe racial insult, and the furious walkout of Asia's most powerful magnate. The market reaction was swift, brutal, and entirely merciless. I watched the live ticker symbol of my family's publicly traded corporation flash across my computer screen. It was green when the market initially opened. By 1:50, it turned a violently bright shade of red. Institutional investors panicked, first dumping massive blocks of shares to avoid the impending financial crater. Retail investors followed immediately afterward, triggering a massive, uncontrollable avalanche of aggressive panic selling. The trading volume was completely unprecedented. The corporate stock price cracked, fractured, and then gave way under the immense pressure. It dropped 5% in 10 minutes, 10% by the top of the hour, 20% by 2:30 in the afternoon. The television financial anchors were practically shouting over each other, calling it the most spectacular unforced error in modern corporate history. I leaned back comfortably in my chair, resting my hands behind my head, a cold, predatory smile slowly spreading across my face. When the afternoon bell finally rang, signaling the merciful end of the brutal trading day, the damage was completely irreversible. The family company stock had plummeted a staggering 30%. Billions of dollars in market capitalization were wiped out in a single afternoon. My father's precious legacy, the massive empire he built by constantly pushing me down to elevate his completely incompetent son, was burning to the ground. And Trent was standing dead center in the roaring flames holding the match. I picked up my heavy silver pen, pulled a fresh legal pad toward me, and began to carefully write out my initial list of demands. While my silver pen glided across the yellow legal pad, meticulously detailing the exact terms of my family's total corporate surrender. A completely different kind of catastrophic chaos was erupting in the penthouse executive suite of the headquarters. The heavy steel doors of the private elevator slid open, violently hitting the rubber bumpers with a resounding crash. Harrison, my 62-year-old father, and the formidable patriarch of the company marched directly onto the executive floor. His luxurious retirement bliss in Palm Springs was officially shattered. He was wearing a casual linen resort shirt and expensive golf slacks that wildly clashed with the sheer, unadulterated fury radiating from his rigid posture. He had been standing on the 18th green of an exclusive country club when his wealth manager called in absolute panic about the unprecedented stock freefall. Now his face was a terrifying mottled shade of crimson. The terrified administrative assistants scrambled out of his path, pressing themselves flat against the glass partitions as he kicked the heavy doors of the boardroom completely open, shattering the heavy, suffocating silence that had settled over the room since the Chinese delegation walked out. The emergency board of directors meeting had been hastily convened by videoconference minutes earlier, and the massive digital screens lining the walls were filled with the furious faces of the company's major shareholders. They were screaming. The cacophony of their overlapping aggressive voices bounced off the glass walls, demanding immediate and brutal accountability for the financial slaughter happening on the trading floor. Trent was sitting exactly where Mr. Zhang had left him, slumped down in his heavy leather executive chair, staring blankly at the torn pieces of the $500 million contract scattered across his expensive shoes. He looked entirely hollowed out. His custom-tailored Italian suit was severely wrinkled, his perfect hair was disheveled from running his shaking hands through it, and his arrogant swagger was completely destroyed. Harrison completely ignored the screaming shareholders on the digital monitors. He marched directly to the head of the mahogany table, grabbed Trent by the lapels of his expensive jacket, and physically hauled his grown son out of the chair. "What exactly did you do?" Harrison roared, his booming voice easily cutting through the digital noise of the board members. "I leave you in charge for 1 single month, Trent. 1 month to finalize a massive deal that was already completely engineered, packed, and gift-wrapped for you. And I have financial anchors on national television calling my life's work a sinking ship. Explain this to me right now." Trent stammered, his bloodshot eyes darting frantically around the expansive room, desperately looking for a scapegoat that no longer existed. Chad and Tyler were long gone. "It was not my fault, Dad," Trent pleaded, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched whine. "The translation software malfunctioned. It was an honest technical glitch, and Mr. Zhang was completely unreasonable. He just snapped. He refused to negotiate the new container margins and stormed out over a simple misunderstanding about manufacturing quality. We can fix it. I just need to send him an apology basket and a brand new term sheet." A harsh, barking laugh erupted from one of the massive digital screens. It was Eleanor, the largest independent shareholder on the board, and a highly pragmatic woman who had never particularly liked my father's blatant nepotism. "An apology basket," Eleanor yelled, her face practically pressed against her webcam in pure outrage. "Are you entirely out of your mind, Trent? My private network in Shenzhen just informed me that you used a deeply offensive racial slur in a boardroom full of elite Asian executives. You openly insulted their manufacturing integrity to their faces. Zhang is not just walking away from the merger. He has actively blacklisted our entire corporation across the Asian continent. Our stock is down 30%, and our overseas supply chain is effectively dead." Harrison released Trent's lapels, letting his golden boy stumble backward and collapse heavily into the leather chair. The angry crimson color drained rapidly from my father's face, instantly replaced by a sickly ashen gray. He turned slowly toward the digital screens, holding up his shaking hands to quiet the screaming board members. "We will salvage this," Harrison announced, though his voice completely lacked its usual commanding resonance. "I will personally fly out to Shenzhen tonight. I will sit down with Mr. Zhang man to man and smooth this over. We just need to bring Stella into the room to translate and act as a cultural buffer. She knows exactly how to handle his temper." "Where is she?" "Get my daughter on the phone right this second." Trent visibly shrank into his seat, his breathing turning incredibly rapid and shallow. He looked exactly like a trapped animal realizing the cage door was permanently locked. "Dad," Trent whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the syllables. "Stella is not here." "Then call her cell phone." Harrison demanded, his legendary temper instantly flaring back up. "Tell her to drop whatever she is doing and get to the private airstrip." "I cannot do that." Trent choked out, cold sweat pouring down his pale face. "I fired her." The entire boardroom plunged into a sudden, horrifying silence. The furious board members on the digital screens instantly stopped yelling. Harrison froze, completely still, his hand hovering mid-air. He stared at his son, his mind visibly struggling to process the sheer impossible stupidity of the statement he had just heard. "You did what Harrison asked," his voice dropping into a dangerous, icy whisper. "I fired her on Friday afternoon." Trent confessed the words, tumbling out of his mouth in a desperate, panicked rush. "She was trying to undermine my authority. She was demanding too much credit for the merger. I am the chief executive officer, Dad. I needed to establish dominance. I needed to show the board that I could close this deal without her holding my hand." Harrison staggered backward, physically recoiling, as if Trent had just driven a jagged knife directly into his chest. The devastating reality of the situation finally slammed into him with the unstoppable force of a freight train. He had spent years grooming Trent for the corporate throne, willfully ignoring his son's absolute lack of work ethic and intellectual capacity. He had allowed Trent to push me aside, entirely confident that my deeply ingrained familial loyalty would force me to stay and quietly clean up his son's catastrophic messes. But Harrison had never anticipated this specific nightmare. He never imagined that Trent's fragile, raging ego would actually compel him to destroy the single keystone holding their entire international infrastructure together. "You absolute fool!" Harrison breathed, his voice trembling with a potent mixture of unbridled rage and profound terror. You arrogant, brainless fool. Stella did not just handle the translations. She managed the critical relationships. She controlled the complex logistics grid. She was the only person in this entire building who understood the legal matrices of our overseas tax structures. You did not just fire a replaceable employee, Trent. You fired the entire operational engine of this corporation. Eleanor unmuted her microphone again, her voice dripping with lethal corporate pragmatism. Harrison, Eleanor stated clearly, the board is convening for an official emergency vote in exactly 1 hour. We are formally demanding Trent's immediate resignation as chief executive officer. And if you cannot figure out a way to get your daughter back into this building by tomorrow morning to stop this catastrophic bleeding, we will be demanding your immediate resignation as chairman of the board right after. Harrison did not argue. He did not defend his precious son. He simply stared at the ruined pieces of the contract on the floor, the horrifying realization finally setting in. They were entirely powerless. The empire was rapidly crumbling, and the only person capable of saving them was the exact woman they had spent their entire lives treating like completely disposable garbage. Harrison did not waste a single second staring at the terrified faces on the digital monitors. He turned on his heel and stormed directly out of the shattered boardroom, grabbing Trent by the back of his ruined suit collar and physically hauling his grown son toward the private executive elevator. The drive across downtown Seattle was a masterclass in suffocating, highly toxic silence. Harrison sat in the back of the armored corporate luxury SUV, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might shatter under the pressure. He spent the entire 20-minute ride furiously typing on his phone, desperately trying to hold off the panic-stricken institutional shareholders who were actively liquidating their positions. Trent sat rigidly next to him, staring blankly out the tinted windows at the gray afternoon sky, visibly vibrating with sheer panic while desperately trying to construct a mental narrative where he was still the victim of this catastrophe. The titans of industry were in total freefall, and their only parachute was currently sitting in a downtown high-rise. Upstairs, I was seated calmly at my dining room table, meticulously reviewing the freshly printed vendor contracts for my newly registered LLC. Jamal was packing up his heavy leather briefcase, and Nora was quietly pouring a fresh cup of dark roast coffee. When the heavy, aggressive pounding started at my front door, none of us jumped. We knew exactly who it was. The sheer desperation vibrating through the thick wooden door was palpable. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee, stood up from the table, and walked over to the entryway. I did not bother checking the security peephole. I unlocked the heavy brass deadbolt and pulled the door open. My father stood in the hallway, his face flushed a dark, furious crimson, breathing heavily as if he had sprinted up the entire 12 flights of stairs instead of taking the elevator. Trent was hovering entirely behind him, looking like a thoroughly beaten dog, his eyes darting nervously toward the floor. They looked absolutely pathetic. The invincible corporate monarchs were reduced to sweating, frantic messes standing uninvited on my welcome mat. I leaned casually against the doorframe, crossing my arms over my chest, entirely unbothered by their sudden presence. "Hello, Harrison," I said smoothly, deliberately using his first name to establish the immediate and violent shift in our power dynamic. "To what do I owe the absolute pleasure of this unexpected visit?" Harrison pushed past me without waiting for an invitation, marching directly into my living room as if he still owned the title deed to my life. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Jamal standing by the dining table glaring at him with the cold, predatory calculation of a corporate shark. Harrison quickly masked his surprise and turned back to face me. He did not look sorry. He did not look remorseful. He looked exactly like the tyrannical patriarch who had spent 33 years demanding absolute, unquestioning obedience from his daughter. "Get your coat and your laptop right now," Stella Harrison ordered, his booming voice echoing loudly through my quiet apartment. His tone was entirely devoid of an apology. He spoke to me like a disobedient servant who had simply missed a shift. "We are in the middle of a massive corporate crisis. Your brother made a slight miscalculation in the boardroom this morning, and Zhang is throwing a completely disproportionate temper tantrum. I have the corporate jet fueled and waiting on the private tarmac. We are flying to Shenzhen in exactly 1 hour to clean up this mess." I stared at him, genuinely marveling at the sheer, unadulterated audacity of his words. A slight miscalculation, I repeated, letting a dry, humorless laugh escape my lips. He used a deeply offensive racial slur in front of an elite Asian delegation and cost your company a $500 million contract, Dad. That is not a miscalculation. That is a total operational fatality. Harrison waved his hand dismissively, completely brushing off the magnitude of the disaster. That is exactly why you need to be on that plane, he demanded, stepping closer to me, attempting to use his physical size to intimidate me back into submission. You are the designated cultural liaison. You know exactly how these people operate. You will sit down with Zhang, apologize for the cultural misunderstanding, and leverage your relationship to get that contract signed before the market opens tomorrow morning. This is about the legacy of our family, Stella. It is about honoring the name I built for you. You need to put your petty sibling rivalry aside and do your duty to this family immediately. The absolute toxicity of his manipulation was breathtaking. He was actively trying to gaslight me into believing that fixing Trent's catastrophic failure was my moral obligation. He was weaponizing the concept of family loyalty, the exact same loyalty he had relentlessly exploited to keep me severely underpaid, overworked, and entirely unappreciated for a decade. He expected me to grovel before a billionaire to save the reputation of the brother who had fired me 48 hours earlier. Before I could even formulate a response to his staggering delusion, Trent stepped out from behind our father. My brother puffed out his chest, desperately trying to salvage some microscopic shred of his shattered executive authority. He smoothed the lapels of his wrinkled designer suit and looked at me with a sickeningly arrogant expression. Look, Stella, Trent said, his voice trembling slightly despite his aggressive posture. I am willing to be the bigger person here. I admit that our transition of power on Friday afternoon was slightly rushed. But Dad and I discussed it on the ride over, and I am prepared to offer you a highly generous pardon for your prior insubordination. Jamal let out a loud, mocking scoff from the dining room, but Trent completely ignored him, entirely, focused on delivering his rehearsed, pathetic negotiation tactic. I am officially reinstating your employment, Trent declared, lifting his chin as if he were bestowing a royal knighthood upon a starving peasant. You can have your old office back. And because I recognize the immediate stress of the current situation, I am authorized to offer you a highly competitive 5% raise on your base salary. But you have to sign a brand new non-disclosure agreement immediately, and you have to get Mr. Zhang back to the negotiating table tonight. The silence in my apartment stretched out thick and incredibly heavy. Nora covered her mouth to physically stifle a laugh. Jamal crossed his arms, staring at Trent with a look of pure, unadulterated pity. I looked back and forth between my father and my brother, genuinely astounded by their complete detachment from reality. They had lost $500 million. Their stock was entirely cratering. Their entire Asian supply chain was permanently destroyed. And they were standing in my living room offering me a pathetic 5% raise as if they were throwing a tiny scrap of meat to a loyal, obedient dog. They genuinely believed they still held all the cards. They thought my entire existence was defined by their approval and their payroll. They had absolutely no idea that they were standing in the newly established corporate headquarters of their deadliest competitor, demanding blind loyalty from a woman who had already legally weaponized their own incompetence to orchestrate their complete and total destruction. I stared at Trent's outstretched hand, letting the silence stretch until it became suffocating. I did not blink, shift my weight, or allow even a microscopic fraction of their toxic manipulation to penetrate my armor. I felt 8 years of meticulously calculated rage finally uncoiling in my chest. My father had programmed me to flinch at his raised voice, shrink my ambition to accommodate his fragile son, and continually apologize for simply taking up oxygen in their boardroom. I was the invisible workhorse absorbing emotional abuse while generating massive profits. That programming was now entirely erased. Looking at the two men who had terrorized my entire life, I felt only cold, clinical disgust. 5%! I repeated, my voice dropping into a register of such absolute freezing calm that my father actually took a half step backward. You stand in my home bleeding out $500 million of market capitalization because of your own catastrophic arrogance, and you offer me a 5% raise to play the obedient maid. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, closing the distance between us. Trent immediately dropped his hand, his arrogant posture crumbling under the sheer weight of my stare. I am going to make this incredibly clear, so you never misunderstand your position in my life ever again. I am not returning to the office. I am not getting on your private jet. I am not flying to Shenzhen to grovel at the feet of a billionaire because you were too utterly incompetent to respect him. But you have to, Trent stammered, his voice rising in sheer panic. Dad said it is your duty. The board is demanding my resignation by tomorrow morning if we do not fix this. You cannot just let the company burn, Stella. I did not start the fire, Trent. I shot back, my words striking like physical blows. You did. You took a match to 8 years of my meticulous labor because you could not stand the fact that an Asian billionaire respected a woman more than he respected you. You fired me to stroke your own pathetic, fragile ego. You shoved a boilerplate termination contract in my face without consulting the legal department because you desperately needed the instant gratification of humiliating me in front of the entire executive floor. I turned to my father, who stood rigidly still, trying to project absolute control. You enabled this, Harrison, I stated, stripping away the title of Dad forever. You watched him fail upwards for a decade. You covered up his missed deadlines and complete lack of strategic vision. You forced me to do his work, let him sign my logistics frameworks, and then patted yourself on the back for raising a corporate prodigy. You built a house of cards on my back and convinced yourself it was a fortress. You gaslit me into believing my value was tied strictly to enduring humiliation for family loyalty. But family does not sabotage you. Family does not intentionally suppress your potential so a mediocre golden boy can maintain his unearned delusion of grandeur. You watch your tone with me, Stella, Harrison warned, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. I am your father and I am the chairman of this corporation. I built the empire you are currently trying to dismantle. Yao built an empire on bullying and manipulation. I countered smoothly, my voice carrying the lethal force of an executioner's blade. It is crumbling because the modern world does not tolerate your brand of incompetence. Mr. Zhang did not walk out simply because Trent used a racial slur. He walked out because Trent represents everything he despises. You sent a spoiled, unqualified child to negotiate with a self-made titan. You insulted Zhang's intelligence, his culture, and the fundamental concept of respect. And you actually thought I would jump at the chance to come back and translate your apologies. I took another step closer, forcing both of them to retreat toward my front door. You do not understand the absolute magnitude of what happened on Friday afternoon. When you fired me, you did not just remove an employee. You fundamentally severed the only structural pillar holding your international supply chain together. You handed me a legally binding separation agreement that completely voided my executive non-compete clauses. Harrison completely froze, his eyes widening in sudden, unmitigated horror as the legal reality finally clicked in his brain. You did not, Harrison whispered, turning slowly to look at his sweating, trembling son. Tell me you did not use the generic template. I used what I could find on the server. Trent whined defensively, physically shrinking away from our father's terrifying glare. I just wanted her out of the building. I did not know it would override the original covenant. Jamal stepped forward from the dining room, holding up a freshly printed document, his predatory smile returning in full force. She is a completely free agent, Harrison Jamal declared with brutal satisfaction. No geographical restrictions, no industry boundaries, no non-solicitation clauses whatsoever. She legally owns every single relationship she built over the last decade. I looked directly into my father's terrified eyes, delivering the final devastating blow. I am not a dog you can kick into the street and whistle back when you need your garbage cleaned up, I stated, each word dripping with absolute unwavering conviction. I am a completely independent competitor. And as of tomorrow morning, when my new consulting firm officially opens its doors, I am going to systematically absorb every single manufacturing partner, logistics director, and supply chain executive in your entire Asian network. You are entirely finished, both of you. The legacy is dead, and you handed me the permission slip to bury it. Now get out of my apartment before I have my lawyer call the police for trespassing. I pointed a steady finger directly at the open hallway. The time for negotiations, apologies, and family favors is permanently over. Close the door behind you. Harrison did not move. He stood absolutely frozen on the threshold of my apartment, his expensive resort wear looking utterly ridiculous against the backdrop of his total corporate defeat. For 33 years, my father had controlled every single room he ever walked into through sheer intimidation and financial leverage. Now his boots were glued to my hardwood floor, and the terrifying realization that his leverage was completely gone paralyzed him. Trent was practically hyperventilating behind him, his hands gripping his father's shoulders, as if Harrison was a human shield against the brutal reality of their situation. Stella, you are making a highly emotional decision. Harrison tried one last time, his voice a desperate gravelly whisper. You are angry. I understand that. I even respect it. But you do not throw away family over a temporary business dispute. You do not intentionally burn down the house we built for you just to prove a point. I did not build a house with you, Harrison, I replied, my voice slicing through the heavy air with surgical precision. I built a massive fortress for you while you forced me to sleep in the mud outside the gates. Do not dare stand in my home and talk to me about family loyalty or building a legacy. You spent the last decade taking absolute unearned credit for my intelligence. You stood on stage at every single shareholder meeting smiling for the financial press and accepted prestigious industry awards for record-breaking international profits. But we both know the absolute truth now, do we not? I took a deliberate step closer, my eyes locking entirely onto his. You did not secure the Asian supply chain on a pristine golf course in Palm Springs, Harrison. Trent did not negotiate the delicate shipping margins while he was drinking heavily with his fraternity brothers at exclusive alumni mixers. The success of your golden empire was funded entirely by my blood, my sweat, and my complete lack of a personal life. It was funded by my brutal 60-hour work weeks. It was funded by me sitting entirely alone in a dark office at 3 in the morning, calculating complex time zone differentials, and frantically correcting Trent's catastrophic spreadsheet errors before the board of directors could see them. I missed holidays. I missed birthdays. I missed my entire 20s because you systematically convinced me that my only value in this world was acting as a permanent invisible safety net for your wildly incompetent son. Trent flinched as if I had physically struck him across the face. But I was the executive vice president. Trent mumbled, his voice so weak it was barely audible over his own rapid breathing. I signed the official documents. I was the public face of the entire international division. You were a highly paid mascot, Trent. I shot back, turning my lethal focus entirely onto him. You were a glorified hood ornament on a massive machine you did not know how to build, drive, or maintain. You called me a glorified translator on Friday afternoon. You told me I was dead weight. You told me I severely lacked the intellectual capacity to understand your modern corporate synergy. Well, the dead weight is officially gone. Let us see exactly how fast your shiny new machine crashes into a brick wall without me steering the wheel. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. There were no more cards for them to play. The manipulative guilt trips had completely failed. The pathetic financial bribes had been brutally rejected. They were entirely out of ammunition. I looked at the two men who had terrorized my psyche for my entire adult life. I genuinely expected to feel a massive surge of adrenaline or a wave of overwhelming sadness. Instead, I felt nothing but an incredibly profound, liberating emptiness. They were simply two terrified, mediocre men standing in my hallway, desperately trying to cling to an illusion of absolute power that had just completely evaporated into thin air. Get out, I commanded, my voice dropping to a dangerous, uncompromising register. Harrison opened his mouth to speak, to launch another desperate volley of toxic manipulation, but the words died instantly in his throat. He looked directly into my eyes and saw the absolute terrifying truth. The obedient, terrified daughter he had meticulously programmed was completely gone. I was a corporate executioner, and I had just calmly handed him his own severed head. He slowly took a step backward, crossing the threshold and moving out into the sterile, brightly lit hallway of my apartment building. Trent immediately stumbled backward with him, his shoulders completely slumped, his arrogant posture permanently destroyed. I grabbed the edge of the heavy solid oak door. I did not break eye contact with my father for a single fraction of a second. I wanted him to see the exact moment his reign of terror officially ended. I wanted the image of my unyielding, completely apathetic face permanently burned into his memory. "Goodbye, Harrison," I said softly. I slammed the heavy door shut with explosive force. The loud, violent crack echoed through the quiet apartment like a gunshot, signaling the absolute and permanent end of an era. I immediately reached up and threw the heavy brass deadbolt. The sharp metallic click of the lock sliding firmly into place was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire life. I stood in my entryway for a long moment, my hand resting flat against the cool wood of the door, feeling the satisfying, heavy vibration of absolute victory coursing through my veins. I turned around and walked back to my dining room table to finish drafting my empire. On the other side of the thick wooden barrier, the atmosphere in the hallway was suffocatingly bleak. Harrison stood perfectly still, staring blankly at the brass numbers fixed to the center of my apartment door. He did not raise his hand to knock again. He did not shout threats through the wood. He simply stood there as the sheer, devastating magnitude of the situation finally settled deeply into his bones. The golden empire he had ruthlessly built, the massive legacy he had arrogantly planned to pass down to his beloved son, was completely gone. It was not just severely damaged, it was entirely vaporized. Trent leaned heavily against the hallway wall, slowly sliding down until he was sitting flat on the carpeted floor, completely oblivious to the expensive fabric of his custom-tailored suit, rubbing against the industrial flooring. He buried his face in his shaking hands, a pathetic muffled sob escaping his chest. He had desperately wanted the instant gratification of playing the ruthless boss, and he had successfully achieved it. He was now the absolute, undisputed ruler of a corporate empire composed entirely of ashes. Harrison's cell phone began to vibrate violently in the pocket of his expensive resort slacks. It buzzed relentlessly, a loud, angry electronic hum cutting through the silent hallway. He slowly reached into his pocket and pulled the device out. The screen was completely lit up with a barrage of incoming messages and frantic missed calls. It was Eleanor. It was the furious board of directors. It was his lead wealth manager. The company stock price had just completely broken through its lowest support level in the history of the corporation. The emergency board meeting was rapidly accelerating from a panicked discussion into an official legally binding vote of no confidence. Harrison stared at the glowing digital screen, his hands trembling violently. He looked down at Trent, the arrogant golden boy, who was currently weeping on the floor of a generic apartment hallway. There was no safety net left. There was no invisible workhorse waiting in the shadows to clean up the mess. The heavy oak door was permanently locked, and the massive fire they had recklessly started was now rapidly consuming the very ground beneath their feet. Harrison slowly lowered the ringing phone, letting the desperate calls echo out into the empty corridor, completely paralyzed by the terrifying realization that they were genuinely, completely, and utterly alone in the dark. The devastating reality of their isolation lingered in the cold apartment hallway for exactly 36 agonizing hours before the final brutal execution was officially scheduled. By Wednesday morning, the relentless Seattle rain was violently lashing against the floor-to-ceiling glass windows of the corporate headquarters, perfectly mirroring the absolute chaos unfolding inside the penthouse boardroom. The emergency meeting of the board of directors was not just a formal gathering to discuss quarterly margins. It was a vicious corporate tribunal. The massive mahogany table, usually a symbol of my father's unquestioned dominance, now felt exactly like a chopping block. Eleanor sat at the absolute center of the table, flanked by 12 deeply furious institutional shareholders, their faces grim and uncompromising. Harrison sat at the far end, his usual seat of power, but he looked completely diminished. The arrogant resort wear was gone, replaced by his darkest, most conservative charcoal suit, though it hung loosely on his frame as if he had aged 10 years in 2 days. Trent sat next to him, sweating so profusely that his expensive silk collar was visibly stained. The tension in the room was not just thick, It was entirely suffocating, pressing down on the two men with the crushing weight of a collapsing skyscraper. "We will bypass the standard reading of the minutes," Eleanor announced, her voice slicing through the heavy silence like a guillotine blade. "We are bleeding out, gentlemen, and we do not have the luxury of observing parliamentary procedure while the patient is actively dying on the table." She pulled a thick, freshly printed financial dossier from her leather portfolio and dropped it forcefully onto the mahogany surface. The loud smack echoed sharply off the glass walls. "Let us review the exact scale of this catastrophe." Eleanor continued, her eyes fixed entirely on Trent with absolute unblinking predatory focus. "At market close on Tuesday, our stock price plummeted by a staggering 42%. We have officially triggered 3 separate automatic trading halts to prevent a total institutional sell-off. But the domestic market panic is merely a symptom of the actual disease. The real massacre is happening overseas." Trent shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair, desperately trying to wipe the heavy layer of cold sweat from his forehead without drawing attention to his violently trembling hands. He opened his mouth to speak, but Eleanor immediately raised a single commanding finger, silencing him instantly. "I am not finished, Trent," she snapped, her tone dripping with lethal corporate authority. "As of 6 o'clock this morning, the shockwaves from your disastrous performance in Shenzhen have triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. We have not just lost the Zhong merger. 5 of our primary manufacturing partners in Guangzhou have officially suspended their pending freight orders. The logistics cartel in Singapore has frozen all of our maritime transit lines, explicitly citing a complete lack of confidence in the current executive leadership. They refuse to load our containers onto their cargo ships. We have $600 million of perishable inventory sitting completely stagnant on loading docks across the Asian continent, rotting in the sun, while you sit here sweating in your designer suit." Harrison gripped the edges of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning entirely white. "Eleanor, please," Harrison pleaded, his legendary baritone voice cracking under the immense pressure. "We are fully aware of the supply chain bottlenecks, but these are deeply emotional reactions from our international partners. Business is business. They are panicking because the market is panicking. It is a temporary feedback loop." "A temporary feedback loop," another board member, a ruthless venture capitalist named Marcus, interrupted with a sharp, barking laugh. "Do not insult our intelligence, Harrison. I spent the last 12 hours on frantic conference calls with every major supply chain director in our Pacific network. They are not panicking. They are highly organized, and they are openly rebelling. They are explicitly stating that they only did business with this corporation because they entirely trusted your daughter. They trusted Stella to navigate the complex regulatory frameworks. They trusted her operational integrity. With her gone, they view this entire corporation as a massive sinking liability." Trent finally cracked. He slammed his palms flat onto the table, leaning forward in a desperate, pathetic attempt to project the executive authority he had entirely lost. "You are all overreacting," Trent practically yelled, his voice shrill and panicked. "It has barely been 48 hours. You cannot dismantle my entire executive administration based on 2 bad days in the market. I just need a little more time. Give me 1 week. Just 7 days to fly a new crisis management team out to Guangzhou. I will personally negotiate new terms. I will offer them aggressive discounts on the upcoming quarter. I will fix this." Eleanor stared at him, her expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated disgust. "Offer them aggressive discounts," she repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "We are currently hemorrhaging $20 million a day in frozen operational capital, and your brilliant strategic solution is to slash our remaining profit margins just to beg our own partners to stay. You do not even understand the fundamental mechanics of the crisis you actively created." "I am the chief executive officer," Trent insisted, his voice breaking completely, a terrifying edge of hysteria creeping into his tone. "You placed me in this position. You approved my promotion. You cannot just abandon me the second things get complicated. I am asking for 1 single week. 1 week to prove that I can stabilize the ship." Harrison leaned forward, his eyes darting frantically around the room, trying to make eye contact with shareholders. He had played golf with men. He had made incredibly wealthy over the past decade. He is right, Harrison interjected, his voice dripping with absolute desperation. We just need a brief runway to execute damage control. We are actively headhunting top-tier corporate diplomats to replace Stella. We have aggressive recruiters pulling talent from every major competitor. We can bridge this gap. Just give us until next Wednesday before you make any rash, irreversible decisions. The profound silence that followed their pathetic pleading was heavier than anything I had ever witnessed in that building. The institutional shareholders simply looked at each other, silent, invisible communication passing rapidly between them. They were not looking at two powerful corporate titans negotiating a difficult quarter. They were looking at a desperate, delusional father trying to shield his wildly incompetent son from a fiery execution that was already completely inevitable. Marcus leaned back in his expensive leather chair, tenting his fingers together as he looked directly at Harrison. We are not making rash decisions, Harrison Marcus stated coldly. We are making surgical amputations to save the remaining vital organs of this company. You are talking about headhunting new talent while the entire building is actively burning to the ground. Our overseas partners are not waiting for us to recruit strangers. They have already found a new home. Harrison frowned, genuine confusion warring with the sheer panic on his face. What are you talking about? He demanded. The non-compete clauses in our standard executive contracts guarantee that our partners cannot legally jump ship to a new firm for at least 18 months. Eleanor reached back into her leather portfolio and pulled out a single neatly printed piece of paper. She slid it smoothly across the polished mahogany surface until it stopped directly in front of Trent. It was a formal press release scheduled to hit the global financial wire in exactly 15 minutes. Trent stared down at the document, his bloodshot eyes widening in absolute unmitigated horror. His mouth opened and closed silently, completely unable to process the words printed in bold black ink. Read it aloud. Trent. Eleanor commanded, her voice ringing with the finality of a judge delivering a death sentence. Read it to your father so he understands exactly why your requested week of damage control is completely and utterly irrelevant. Before Trent could force the devastating words through his tightening throat, the heavy mahogany doors of the penthouse boardroom swung open with a resounding theatrical crash. The heavy brass handles hit the glass partitions so hard the entire wall shuddered. I strode directly into the room, the sharp heels of my designer shoes clicking rhythmically against the polished marble floor. I wore a razor-sharp, impeccably tailored white suit that radiated absolute unbureaucratic power. It was the exact opposite of the muted grays my father had always forced me to wear. I was not alone. Flanking my right side was Jamal, carrying his heavy leather briefcase and wearing a smile of pure predatory anticipation. Flanking my left was a man whose mere presence instantly sucked the remaining oxygen out of the enormous room. It was Mr. Zhang. He wore a flawless bespoke suit projecting a calm, terrifying authority that instantly reduced my father and brother to terrified amateurs. Trent completely lost his mind. He leaped out of his expensive leather chair, knocking it over violently. His face contorted into a mask of sheer, unhinged hysteria. Security, Trent screamed, his voice cracking wildly as he pointed a trembling finger directly at my chest. Get corporate security up here right this second. She is trespassing on private property. She was legally terminated. Remove her from this building immediately. The institutional shareholders fell completely silent. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, a deeply satisfied smile playing on her lips. She did not reach for the security button. Nobody moved to defend the crumbling regime. Harrison was physically paralyzed, his eyes locked onto Mr. Zhang in absolute unmitigated horror. He finally understood the press release sitting in front of him. Jamal stepped smoothly past me, completely ignoring Trent's screaming meltdown. He approached the edge of the massive mahogany table, popping the latches of his briefcase with two sharp clicks. He withdrew a thick stack of legal declarations and dropped them forcefully next to Eleanor's financial dossier. You do not need to call security, Trent. Jamal announced, his voice carrying the calm resonance of a corporate executioner. We are not here as former employees looking for a handout. We are here as the primary executive board of Vanguard Global Logistics. We are officially your newest and largest international competitor. Jamal placed his hands flat on the polished wood, leaning forward to look directly into my father's terrified eyes. And as of 8 o'clock this morning, Mr. Zhang has officially signed on as our primary equity partner. He has transferred his entire $500 million manufacturing portfolio directly under Stella's exclusive management. Mr. Zhang stepped forward, his expression carved from absolute stone. He looked at Trent with profound disgust. "You insulted my honor," Mr. Zhang stated, his English completely flawless. "But your sister honors our shared history. She understands true competence. You fired the architect of your own empire, and I have simply chosen to follow the architect to a new castle. Your building is now completely empty." Harrison slowly sank back into his chair, the last remaining drops of color draining from his face as he realized the checkmate was absolute, flawless, and legally bulletproof. I stepped forward, claiming the exact spot at the head of the mahogany table where my father used to orchestrate his undisputed reign. "I am officially announcing the launch of Vanguard Global Logistics," I declared, my voice ringing with absolute, unshakable authority. Mr. Zhang stepped up beside me and pulled a heavy gold fountain pen from his tailored breast pocket. Jamal smoothly slid a thick leather-bound contract across the polished wood. Without breaking eye contact with my shattered father, Mr. Zhang signed his name with sharp, deliberate strokes. "That is a $500 million exclusive manufacturing commitment," I stated, letting the massive number echo off the glass walls. "We did not just take your primary equity partner. We took the entire operational foundation of your global network." Trent practically lunged across the ruined table, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged desperation. "You cannot do this!" he screamed, his voice cracking wildly. "The non-compete clauses in your executive contract are ironclad. Our legal team will bury you in litigation for the rest of your natural life." Jamal simply laughed, a cold, clinically predatory sound that sent a visible shiver down Trent's spine. He reached into his briefcase and began rapidly sliding freshly printed legal documents to every single institutional shareholder at the table. "Read them carefully," Jamal instructed the room. When Trent fired Stella on Friday afternoon, he utilized a highly flawed boilerplate termination template from an outdated server. It completely and legally voided her original employment covenant. She has absolutely zero geographical restrictions and zero non-solicitation clauses. She is a completely free agent, and she legally owns every single relationship she built for you.